don't know what this means. Click to read your unread notifications. We don't have any, but it says 8. Anyways. Let's see if I'm back. I'm back. Alright. Sorry about that. I guess it doesn't make a difference really to anyone who is watching and a recording because you just click on the next video. But for anyone who is watching live, welcome back. Sorry about that. I was saying, like, it was bound to happen eventually, honestly. My computer is hella old and shitty, and I used to joke that it had the coronavirus, but people kept saying that's not a good joke to make. So, but it's true, in a sense. So, anyway, especially because, you know, you hear about, like, how the internet connection is being weighed down by this whole thing. So I wasn't that far off. But anyway, hopefully this is working now. The only way I could really tell is if, like, this thing, my mouse kind of goes out. And so, yeah, okay. But now the internet is freezing. Okay. I'm just gonna pray that it's good and get started. Okay. Or get back to where I was, basically. So, Gramsci has made the useful analytic distinction between civil and political society, in which the former is made up of voluntary affiliations, like schools, families, unions, and the latter of state institutions. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is to take this word affiliation right here and to think about it for a second. Because this word affiliation is also a Saïdian concept. Okay, he has like a lot written on affiliation and filiation, these two different concepts for him. And so I don't have the best memory of like what he said about it, but I do know that he said it about. He said a lot about it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just go to where I know he talked about it and just see if I can find it. We're on stream, so we're not in any rush. Let's see, because I know that he talks about it in this book that he has called The World, the Text, the Critic. And I don't know if I have that PDF, but let's see if I do. Question of Palestine. Let's see here. The thing is, like, when you're searching for someone like Edward Said or like a text like The World, the Text, the Critic, it's gonna be like mentioned in like everything else you've ever read because it's like a text like that. So the Google search doesn't really go anywhere like that, but or the Google search, the Finder search. But let's see if we can do it this way. No. Oh, got it. Let's try this. R. Radhakrishnan, a Saïd dictionary. Affiliation, page 1. Look at this. We have a whole thing. Affiliation. This is a classic example of a simple and non-technical word that Said inflects imaginatively to produce a critical semantic range. First of all, rather than define the word or fix its denotation in isolation, Said makes it a point to differentiate affiliation from filiation. Whereas filiation, as in filial duty or piety, represents a genetic, dynastic, familial, natal, nativist, or natural biological order. By that, what I get from that is like, whereas filiation refers to some sort of like idea, like a family type idea, like either by birth or by genetics or by like scientific connection, by like whatever, lineage. Affiliation is a mode of belonging based on secular and historical choices that an individual makes. Choices that may or may not revalidate or re-recognize the pattern of filiation. Okay, so that's a really, really great resource. So we can go back to this now and use that, basically, to really think about what he's saying here about Gramsci, right? So, Gramsci has made the useful distinction between civil and political society. The former is made up of voluntary affiliations, like schools, families, and unions. Well, that's interesting, right? So we already sort of see a sort of tension between the way he's using that here and the way that like the definition that Aryabhata Krishnan gave uses it, right? And that's not to say that either of them are wrong, but that sort of like tension or like difference between the two, we can maybe just like really think about productively. Let me just kind of move this so I can see. Okay, so I am streaming, thank God. Okay, so why would he say, in the Gramscian sense, that, let's say for something like a family, for example, is a voluntary affiliation? Because Said's word voluntary here, this is my first thing I'm thinking, Said's word voluntary here makes sense in the way that in the Said dictionary we just looked up, he's talking about affiliation. But I think maybe the way I can read that is what he's saying is in the Gramscian sense, a family is also voluntary. Maybe not in his sense of what he's talking about, or maybe not in the traditional sense of a family, but in the Gramscian sense it is. Okay? And the reason is because the way that he's reading Gramsci from my reading of him is that these are things in which they don't involve direct force or domination. And so technically, it's your choice, I guess, to be affiliated like that. I obviously have not seen some families. Just kidding. But anyway, so the latter, state institution, the army, the police, the central bureaucracy, whose role in the polity is direct domination. Okay. Okay. And so what we have here then is this distinction between a sort of external force called political society that is kind of imparted onto this other entity by way of force, right? So army, police, and central bureaucracy are a sort of downward moving list of those things for me. That's how I interpret it. Like army is like the external force of the external force, right? And then police is like the internal force of the external force. And then central bureaucracy is like the proliferation of that internal force into like everyday life. Like when I think of central bureaucracy, I think of like the DMV or something. That's how I think about that. Whereas in other words, the distinction that Gramsci is making is that there's a sort of indirect domination, or non-dominating, non-coercive at least, aspect of society that includes schools, families, and unions. Okay? Things that don't impart themselves on you externally, that you don't have to be coerced to be part of. Okay. Culture, of course, is to be found operating within civil society, where the influence of ideas, of institutions, and of other persons works not through domination, but by what Gramsci calls consent. And so now we can see sort of how Said is starting to, we can already start to see the way that Said sees what he's talking about in Gramsci, right? And so he never really, it's very interesting because for me, what I think of when I see this is the second time that he has taken this giant Western thinker on power and recapitulated them in one line and then shifted it into his discussion, right? And it's an interesting balance because on one hand, it's not a discounting of them, it's not an easy dismissal of them, it's actually an affirmation of what they're saying. So if it reads as a dismissal, it's only because you've already implicitly assumed that this person deserves more space than this, right? And then you can really get to see like the politics of it and how much value gets put into certain people, right? Because, for example, we would like, if this is surprising to us, it wouldn't be surprising to us for K.M. Panikar here, who is like just casually referred to, right? But so he doesn't actually even casually dismiss them. What he does is he affirms what they're saying. But in affirming what they're saying, he's he's using the idea that they have. He just wants an idea. He's interested in one of their ideas, but it's interesting to him in a different sort of movement of argument, right? And so we can really start to see that here. That's what I think of when I see that, when I read that, because we can start to see that because the first word after this Gramsci sentence is culture. Culture, of course. So if I'm the reader now, which I am, I'm thinking like, okay, so he expects that me as the reader is reading this argument so far, and I'm like, what does Gramsci have to do with culture? Right? That's already what I'm thinking in his mind as the reader when I'm reading him about Gramsci. And why is that? Because this is what he's just talked about, right? But in a very different sense. So the previous sentence is, continued investment made Orientalism as a system of knowledge about the Orient, an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness. Just as that same investment multiplied, indeed made truly productive, the statements proliferating out from Orientalism into the general culture, right? So what we're seeing is Orientalism as this thing that's an idea, and it's institutions, and it's also proliferating out into general culture, not by way of some sort of like force necessarily, but as a natural process of how it works, right? And so we can think about that as we've seen him already clarify. So culture, of course, is to be found operating within civil society, where the influence of ideas, of institutions, and of other persons works not through domination, but by what Gramsci calls consent, right? And so he is still talking about Gramsci here, right? So he's still sort of ventriloquizing Gramsci here. Culture, in other words, culture, in Gramsci's understanding, is to be found operating within civil society, where the culture is operating through consent, not domination, right? In any society, not totalitarian then, certain cultural forms predominate over others, just as certain ideas are more influential than others. Okay, so then in my head, I'm like, and let me just finish the sentence. The form of this cultural leadership is what Gramsci has identified as hegemony, an indispensable concept for any understanding of cultural life in the industrial West. Okay, so what I've learned here when I'm reading him up to here is that he has been discussing Gramsci in order to discuss Orientalism with regard to Gramsci's idea of hegemony, right? And what I understand from this is hegemony for Gramsci is the thing that makes, in Saïd's reading at least. Thank you for the follow. I really appreciate it. Welcome to my stream. Nice to have you. We're in the middle of page 7 of Orientalism, right when he started discussing Gramsci. And so it's really nice to have you. Thanks for the follow. I really appreciate it. So he's been talking about Gramsci so far, after talking about how Orientalism proliferates into the general culture. Then he shifts into Gramsci, right? In Gramsci's discussion of culture. And then he says, so culture in Gramsci is to be found operating within civil society by what Gramsci calls consent. In any society not totalitarian then, certain cultural forms... So basically, what I understand from this sentence is that his reading of Gramsci is that hegemony is the thing that makes certain cultural forms predominate over others in the West. And it's almost identical to what he's just said, to be fair. But I think it has a certain sort of meaning within the Saïdian framework, right? Because as we've been seeing, like, for example, in this last sentence in which he led into Gramsci, continued investment made Orientalism as a system of knowledge about the Orient, an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness, just as that same investment multiplied, indeed made truly productive the statements proliferating out. What he's interested in is this sort of unspoken thing that gives certain ideas value, and they give certain ideas a freedom of movement and a virility of movement, right? And as I've been saying, what he keeps trying to say is that if you follow back the things that have just been accepted, such that certain ideas have already a movement about them. Certain people have already a movement about them. For example, an example that I gave about this last night too was when he's talking about Flaubert and why this French writer, Flaubert, Egyptian model of an Egyptian woman, was so influential. And he says it was not only that he was possessing Kuchikhanem physically, but it was his ability to speak for her and to tell his readers in what way she was typically Oriental, right? So when I see how he's using hegemony in relation to Gramsci's idea of culture here, that's what I think of, because basically what I then think of is he's using Gramsci's idea of hegemony to try to pinpoint this thing, this sort of distribution of value. That's how I read that personally. And so then he says, what Gramsci has identified as hegemony, an indisputable concept for any understanding of cultural life in the West. And then he goes on. Actually, so I'm going to read this. Here he goes on. It is hegemony, or rather the culture. Where am I? It is hegemony, or rather the result of cultural hegemony at work. And so already there, we can start seeing like what I was talking about, I think. So this makes sense now. I think I was reading it in a way that I feel like is a little bit right. Because you see the way he's turning Gramsci slightly. Because while Gramsci is sort of talking about hegemony as a thing, what Saïd wants to do is talk about how the result of cultural hegemony is always reproducing and producing Orientalism. Right? So it's not so much hegemony, but the result of hegemony at work that's reproducing Orientalism. And this is like a slight turn for me, but it's so important actually. It is hegemony, or rather the result of cultural hegemony at work, that gives Orientalism the durability and the strength I have been speaking about so far. And so when I think of that, I think of like everything that I've read so far in terms of especially the three qualifications that we just had, right? So for folks who are just tuning in, we basically, the way that this argument has moved in this second section is Saïd has made three qualifications on what he's previously said, which is that Orientalism is basically a thing that is defining our idea of history and of reality and of time and of all these concepts. It coheres concepts, right? And so then he's made three qualifications. The first one is that the concept called the Orient is not fully representative of whatever it's trying to represent. It can't be, it's impossible. You have to unsettle the idea that the concept called Orient is universally true. Then he steps back from that and says you have to unsettle the idea that the method by which your concepts come to be universally true is the only method of understanding or of learning there is. Right? So you have to unsettle the idea that such things happen simply as a necessity of the imagination. Then he qualifies that to say you have to unsettle the idea that the paradigm called Orientalism that informs these methods is universally true. It doesn't have to be the way it is either. Right? And so then he moves into Gramsci from here, and in turning Gramsci, he's talking about it is hegemony, or rather the result of cultural hegemony, that gives Orientalism the durability and the strength I have been speaking about so far, right? So it's the result of this sort of value already accepted in ideas that keeps this sort of process by which these things are being naturalized at every level going. That's how I understand why he would weave this discussion of Gramsci into after these last three qualifications, right? Because he's trying to explain now. So now after he's made these three qualifications, which are each qualifications on the last one, he's sort of qualifying that last qualification to try to explain to you why you were getting caught up in all this stuff. Why at each new qualification you realize as you're reading him, oh shoot, I fell into that trap. Then he qualifies again. Oh shoot, I was in this deeper trap. Then he qualifies it again. Oh shoot, I was in this deeper trap. And then he says the reason you're in this deeper trap is the result of cultural hegemony at work. So that's how I understand the movement of this. And the result of cultural hegemony at work is what gives Orientalism the durability and strength I've been speaking about so far. So that's how I read this. And so I'm gonna read this whole paragraph from the beginning and then move on to the next sentence. And I'll actually start reading it from this last line of this previous sentence. Whoa, calm down, PDF. Okay. Continued investment made Orientalism as a system of knowledge about the Orient, an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness, just as that same investment multiplied, indeed made truly productive, the statements proliferating out from Orientalism into the general culture. Gramsci has made the useful analytic distinction between civil and political society, in which the former is made up of voluntary affiliations, like schools, families, and unions, and the latter of state institutions, whose role in the polity is direct domination. Culture, of course, is to be found operating within civil society, where the influence of ideas and institutions and of other persons works not through domination, but by what Gramsci calls consent. In any society not totalitarian, then, certain cultural forms predominate over others, just as certain ideas are more influential than others. The form of this cultural leadership is what Gramsci has identified as hegemony, an indispensable concept for any understanding of cultural life in the industrial West. It is hegemony, or rather the result of cultural hegemony at work, that gives Orientalism the durability and the strength I have been speaking about so far. Orientalism is never far from what Dennis Hay has called the idea of Europe, a collective notion identifying us against all those non-Europeans, and indeed it can be argued that the major component in European culture is precisely what made that culture hegemonic both in and outside Europe. The idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with all the non-European peoples and cultures. There is, in addition, the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness, usually overriding the possibility that a more independent or more skeptical thinker might have a different view on the matter. Okay, so, here we go. There is, in addition, the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness, usually overriding the possibility that a more independent or more skeptical thinker might have had different views on the matter. Okay, so let's start from this first sentence and finish out this paragraph and see how this is working, right? So far he's been like, yeah, we have to unsettle the idea that this paradigm is a real thing. But in doing that, we have to sort of remove its claims to universality or to truth at all levels, including even accepting its boundaries. So even on its own terms. And then he says, Gramsci has this thing about hegemony, and it's hegemony, or rather the result of this hegemony, that gives Orientalism its strength. And how is he defining hegemony here? A form of cultural leadership that basically allows for certain ideas to become more important or more influential than others. Inside his reading. And so then he continues, Orientalism is never far from what Dennis Hay has called the idea of Europe, a collective notion in identifying us Europeans against all those non-Europeans. Okay, so let's stop there for a second. The first thing I'm going to do when I read something like this is I'm going to look up who Dennis Hay is. And then go to the footnote. Okay. So as we kind of found yesterday, every time Saïd quotes someone, it always ends up being this statesman or figure in European history who is immensely important, but who nobody talks about, and he just casually quotes them in like their own, using their phrases to make his points, but he never like gives them time, which is really interesting. And it might be related to Gramsci, this Gramsci and Foucault thing, how he's not really giving them. But anyway, that's aside. So Dennis Hay, born 1915 to 1994. And I'm not saying Dennis Hay was this either. I'm just saying that's what I've kind of seen in the previous citations of people. Was a British historian specializing in medieval and Renaissance Europe, and notable for demonstrating the influence of Italy on events on the rest of the continent. And so Dennis Hay has this book called Europe, The Emergence of an Idea. So there you go. That's what I found from that. And I'm going to just look up the footnote to just see if there's anything interesting back there. Nope. Dennis Hay. The footnote says Dennis Hay, Europe, The Emergence of an Idea, 2nd edition. It's just the book. Almost all the footnotes in this book are just book like links. It's really, really interesting because usually a book like this would have like very long footnotes. Like if you read a book like Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism or something, whose scope is sort of similar to this in terms of its critique, you'll see that there will be some footnotes that are like pages long, right? But in this one, there's almost none, and that are actually him talking at all. So it's really interesting, and I always wonder why that is. Okay. So Orientalism is never far from what Dennis Hay has called the idea of Europe, a collective notion identifying us Europeans against all those non-Europeans. Okay, so the first thing that I notice when I see the sentence is this word against, right? And what that reminds me of actually, when I see this against, is this language actually on the first page. And I don't know why it reminds me of this, but it just does. It's this language on the first page of the Orient's adjacency. So he's in this first page, on the first page of the book, he's trying to explain, kind of introduce what Orientalism is and why the Orient has a particular role for Europe, right? And so he says Orientalism is a way of coming to terms with the Orient, and we can think of the word way there as him kind of talking about it's a way of being, right? And then he says the Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it's also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies, the source of its civilizations and languages, its cultural contestant, and one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. Okay, so, and what we talked about when we talked about this was kind of in the way that the sentence is phrased, the Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, semicolon, the rest of this list. All of these things feel to me to be explications of the implications, if that makes sense. They're him describing the implications of what that adjacency does, why that adjacency matters, right? So it's like the fact that it's adjacent is like in the midst of something else, right? And it also reminds me of this other sentence right here at the bottom of page 3, where he says, this book is trying to show that European culture gains in strength and identity by setting itself off against the Orient as a sort of surrogate and even underground self. And so this word against has been used again, but it really reminds me of this adjacency because it's a very like sort of thing that, let me go back to the page really quick. It feels to me like a sort of thing that is a sort of geographical againstness that also becomes the sort of implications of that againstness, if that makes sense. So I'm just linking like adjacency and againstness in my head. That's how I kind of see it personally. And so this is what, okay, so that's how I read the sentence. When he says Orientalism is never far from the idea of Europe, because it's a collective notion identifying us against all those non-Europeans. Right? And so it's the thing, in other words, when we're thinking about the against and the adjacency, it's the thing that keeps a sort of internal coherence in the idea of Europe that makes it different from all of the Orient around it. Because the thing about the adjacency is that the Orient is literally surrounding Europe on all sides, right? So Europe, as it's developing, as a European way of being is developing, needs to constantly distinguish itself from the Orient in order to understand itself as Europe. So then the idea of Europe in that becomes a collective notion which identifies us against them. That's how I kind of read that. And for, okay. And indeed, it can be argued that the major component in European culture is precisely what made that culture hegemonic both in and outside Europe. Okay. But let's talk about that, because now he's re-woven Gramsci back into it. So this seems really important to me. It feels really, really important, because what we see now is he's talked about Gramsci, started to turn him, a return to his idea of Orientalism, and now he's weaving Gramsci back in. Right? So it's like from Gramsci back to him, and then circling back through like this. And it's kind of this always circling that we kind of see keep happening in his style. But so he wants to introduce Gramsci, introduce himself, and then weave Gramsci back into him, and then keep going, right? So let's take this like carefully. Where is it? And indeed, it can be argued that the major Europe component in European culture is precisely what made that culture hegemonic both in and outside Europe. The idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with all the non-European peoples and cultures. Okay. So I think it's, when I read this, the first thing I think is, I think it's easy. Okay. I think the easiest way to read this, and I'm just going to say this carefully. I think the easiest way to read this sentence is to treat this as endemic to Europe itself. It's an idea of Europe. So it's a European thing, like that Europe is superior, right? But I think the superiorness is the emphatic or the pivot point of this sentence. That's how I read this. The idea of European identity. So, in other words, we can read this easily as saying the idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with all the non-European cultures and peoples and cultures, right? And so, of course, we will, from how we learn to read something like this, we're going to make the word European the pivot point of this. But I want to also just ask myself, like when I'm reading this, if giving the word European that sort of role in the sentence, that sort of dominating role in the sentence, is sort of doing the same thing that he's talking about, especially in this third qualification, where he's been talking about like writing off like this sort of oppositional way of engaging with a European way of being, where you kind of just reverse the system of values and you just write that off. That's the enemy. That's the thing that's worthless, is actually reinscribing the same sort of thing. I wonder if we could read that back in here too, right? And that's why I'm saying that superior, the word superior, might, when I'm thinking about it, be the word that is more like pivotal. Is that a word? Pivotal? Look that up. Yeah, it's a word. That's more pivotal in the sentence, right? And the reason I'm saying that is because he's building this out of that discussion about like the way that we assign value to certain things, or we learn that certain value should be assigned to certain things. And then even by way of like trying to like get out of it, we don't tackle the way that we distribute value, but we just redistribute the value. And that actually you could start to see, when I say it like that, you could really start to see his critique of Marx coming through, right? But anyway, that's another thing. So The idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with... So let's read it both ways, right? Okay. Orientalism is never far from the idea of Europe, a collective notion identifying us Europeans against all those non-Europeans, and indeed against all those non-Europeans. And indeed, it can be argued that the major component in European culture is precisely what made that culture hegemonic both in and outside Europe. The idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with all the non-European peoples and cultures. Okay, now let's read it the other way. Orientalism is never far from the idea of Europe, a collective notion identifying us Europeans against all those non-Europeans, and indeed it can be argued that the major component in European culture is precisely what made that culture hegemonic both in and outside Europe. The idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with all the non-European peoples and cultures. Okay, so for me, that reading feels much closer to me, and the reason is because the word superior is the object of the critique. So the idea that value should be distributed hierarchically, first to oneself and then to others, in the bottom of the hierarchy, so to speak. And that kind of comes out of a need to always be differentiating yourself as from this thing that you feel against. Right? Okay. So then the major component here that makes this culture hegemonic is not its own understanding of it's not necessarily its Europeanness, right? And then when we say it like that, we really see like how clearly fucked up it is. But it's really easy to read the sentence that way, in my opinion, because I already did by accident when I first read it. But the major component in European culture that makes that culture hegemonic is that it sees itself as superior. Is an idea of superiority, actually, I should say. An idea of a value which is distributed hierarchically. That's how I read this. So if you distribute value hierarchically, where value is given more to like whatever's happening within your shit, then you'll really see as a result of that this sort of like self-referentiality of Orientalism in a different kind of angle, right? So in like the very beginning, it's kind of like very interesting and disturbing that like this journalist in Beirut is watching this civil war around him, and yet he's just so self-referential in his thinking. He's like, now my idea of history is going to change. These ideas I had about the Orient are different. But he is the thing that has value in that, right? So his thought he has more weight. History has more weight. Nerval and Chateaubriand, these writers who he's inspired by, who have talked about this Orient that he no longer has, these have more weight, right? And so his kind of attention is going to be drawn there right away. So you can kind of see it from a different angle, what he's talking about now, right? There is, in addition, the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness, usually overriding the possibility that a more independent or more skeptical thinker might have had different views on the matter. Okay. So this sentence is really massive to me, and I think it's just a beautiful sentence because it really like hits so deeply at the heart of what I feel I'm learning from this, to be honest. And what I mean by that is, so first of all, let's take this piece by piece, right? What's the in addition? So obviously, okay, so it's very interesting because European ideas about the Orient, if we just take this phrase right here, we see that it's almost identical to this first definition he has of Orientalism, where he says that Orientalism is anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient. Writes about. So we can see this word about is repeated again, but it's very intentional in both cases. And so anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient is proliferating ideas about the Orient, right? So basically, Orientalist production. That's another way that I understand that. Orientalist production. Right? But he says there is in addition the hegemony of Orientalist production. So what is this? If Orientalist production, or in other words, the movement of Orientalism, the proliferation, the constant resettlement of Orientalism is in addition, then what is he talking about before? Right? And what I see him talking about before then is the idea of European identity as superior in itself. So in other words, the distribution of value, which then allows for something like Orientalism. And then the movement of Orientalism is also itself a sort of proliferation of hegemony, cultural hegemony. And then, okay, themselves, and these ideas themselves reiterate where is it? These ideas themselves reiterate European superiority over Oriental backwardness. So let's take that phrase in itself. I think is very interesting because, so for me, the way I read that when I see that is like, not only is it recapitulating this conversation of superiority, right? But what happens then is that, so in the first case, there is a thing where there is like, in the first case, in what he's talking about before this sentence, there's an idea of value which is differentiated, right? In addition to that, there's the movement of that differentiated value. And I've been talking about movement in the context of this argument, of this book a lot, right? So a sort of freedom of movement, proliferation of movement, virility of movement, kind of being like a signifier of power, right? But you can see superiority here contradicted or in distinction to the word backwardness. So in other words, superiority is manifested as outward or forward movement, whichever way you want. So when I say outward and forward movement, both of those things are identical to me in terms of the kind of the implications of what I'm talking about. Because I think they're the same concept actually in just different dimensional examples. So if you're thinking of this sort of structure in 2 dimensions, then the direction will be forward. Right? I don't know what happened there. Okay. In one sense, the direction is forward, right? If it's a linear thing. If it's a field, which is what we like, or a network, then the movement will be outward, right? It just depends on the sort of way that you're thinking about it in your head, but it's the same thing for me. But the importance of it is that what the Orient has to become then is a sort of backwardness, a sort of whatever, in order to give yourself the impression of moving in any direction, the Orient has to also be characterized as moving in the opposite direction. And what is the result of all of this? It's to override the possibility that a more independent or more skeptical thinker might have a different view on the matter. So for me, when I read to override the possibility of an independent view on the matter, or a different view on the matter, I want to say two things about that makes me think of. The first one is what we've been kind of talking about the whole time, about this sort of like naturalization of these things as truth or reality that he's always fighting against, right? What is the thing that you've already accepted as reality? Whatever made you accept that as reality without questioning it, that's Orientalism. Rather than understanding that all of this, every single thing of this, is a production of power, is a production of domination, is a production of imperialism, is a production of white supremacy. Every single thing that you see. If you see things as uniform, I was talking to one of my friends about this before. Like, so what this makes me think of, for example, is like trends in the academy right now, where there's not only interest in psychoanalysis as a mode of thought, but there's also an implicit belief that the structure of being described in psychoanalysis, for example, like that there's an unconscious and that there's a conscious, for example, even something as simple as that, right? Or that things happen in a sort of Oedipal complex, like in a Freudian idea. Of course, whenever I try to bring ideas in here, I'll try to explain them. So like a Freudian idea that like the sort of ways of relating to each other are based on this Oedipal complex where there's a certain relationship with a mother or an idea of a mother, a father or an idea of a father. And these things dictate relations, right? And the way that these things seem descriptive or accurate is because you seem to see them everywhere, right? You seem to see that, like, oh yeah, everyone seems to have daddy issues or whatever. I don't know. You know what I mean? Or you seem to see everywhere that everyone seems to have an unconscious. You know? If things seem like they're ubiquitous or they're universal, the trap is that is exactly the trap of power and of Orientalism that he's talking about. What you're actually observing is the strength of Orientalism in constituting our idea of reality, such that it affects everyone to that level. And the trap is that once it affects everyone to a certain level, you forget that it's a production of power. You forget that it doesn't have to be that way. Because everything around you makes you feel like it is that way no matter what. And so when he says the word independent here, or skeptical here, that's what I think kind of independent has to do with it. Independent of a sort of collectivity, right? So we see the word Orientalism as sort of cohering a collectivity. Where is it? Collective notion of identity. So in the example I gave of psychoanalysis, even to the extent of the notion that there is an unconscious in our mind and a conscious, and they are distinct and there's a border between them, even the extent of that, what we've done now is we've identified with a collective in which everyone has a conscious and everyone has an unconscious, and there's a border between them. And in doing that, what we've done is we've forgotten that that collective is in itself a product of cultural hegemony. That's how I read this personally. And we can see that he's still kind of always trying to remind us. So he's still trying to explain to us why these sort of things happen. Right? And so I want to read the sentence again. There's an addition. Okay. I want to read this part of the sentence again. Themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness, usually overriding the possibility that a more independent or more skeptical thinker might have had different views on the matter. So you kind of forget in all of this that there might be something totally different. There might be a different way. That's how I read that personally. And so this makes a lot of sense to me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this whole paragraph one more time, and then I'm going to move on to the next paragraph. And it looks like I have 3 viewers here. So if anyone is new here, I'll just take this opportunity, since I just finished this paragraph, to say, like, welcome. and I'm really happy to have you here. Feel free to participate in whatever way you want. So today's the first day that I've been doing this where there's not a kind of more active chat, and it might be because I'm doing it at a different time than I've done the last few days. The last few days that I've started at 4 p.m., which is harder for me and for some of my other followers. It's harder in the later part of the stream because a lot of us are fasting at this time, and so we're breaking our fast in the middle of what that stream would be. And I would much rather do it at this time, starting at 11 and kind of ending around 4 my time. So I hope that when I'm doing it at this time, I could still have a sort of active followerness or active chat. But if you're a new follower in here, feel free to participate in the chat how you want, and feel free to follow. And I hope that you're liking what's going on. And if you do like it, feel free to just tell anyone about it. Spread the word. Tell your friends, because the chat makes this whole stream a stream, or else this is just like a recorded lecture. Well, it's not really a lecture because I'm just kind of like waddling through this, but you know what I mean. So yeah, welcome. Feel free to participate how you want, and I'm happy to have everyone here. And so now that I've gotten through this paragraph, I'm going to just go back and read the last sentence of the last paragraph, through this paragraph, through the beginning of the next one. And that's just so when I finish a long-ass paragraph like this, and I've really broken it down in such a microscopic level, I like to go back and read it and feel if it hits me different. And it always hits me different. You know what I mean? But it's also hitting me in ways that I don't immediately recognize. So I'll feel the echoes of these things that I've learned like in the days after in really uncharacteristic ways. Okay. Continued investment made Orientalism as a system of knowledge about the Orient an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness, just as that same investment multiplied, indeed made truly productive, the statements proliferating out from Orientalism into the general culture. Gramsci has made the useful analytic distinction between, we're right here, civil and political society, in which the former is made up of voluntary or at least rational and non-coercive affiliations, like schools, families, and unions, the latter of state institutions, whose role in the polity is direct domination. Culture, of course, is to be found operating within civil society, where the influence of ideas, of institutions, and of other persons works not through domination, but what Gramsci calls consent. In any society, not totalitarian then, certain cultural forms predominate over others, just as certain ideas are more influential than others. The form of this cultural leadership is what Gramsci has identified as hegemony, an indisputable concept for any understanding of cultural life in the industrial West. We're right here now. It is hegemony, or rather the result of cultural hegemony at work, that gives Orientalism the durability and the strength I have been speaking about so far. Orientalism is never far from what Denis Hay has called the idea of Europe, a collective notion identifying us, Europeans, against all those non-Europeans. And indeed, it can be argued that the major component in European culture is precisely what made that culture hegemonic both in and outside Europe, the idea of European identity as a superior one in comparison with all the non-European peoples and cultures. There is, in addition, the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness, usually overriding the possibility that a more independent or more skeptical thinker might have had different views on the matter. In a quite constant way, Orientalism depends for its strategy on this flexible positional superiority, which puts the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing him the relative upper hand. So now that I read this paragraph again, I actually do have two reflections on it that I feel that I didn't really get before. And the first one is that what he's doing here is again, in his in addition, it's not just the in addition of the ideas as opposed to the identity. it's also the in addition of he's specifying what it is about the Orient that makes it have a particular role in a European way of being, as opposed to all those non-Europeans. And the thing that makes the Orient have a particular role is that its movement has to be fixed in a direction that is that the idea of Europe is departing from. So in general, there's a certain idea of value in which Europe has a European way of being, sees itself as having value, and non-Europeans as not having value. But the fixedness of the Orient, which coheres the identity of Europe, that is something that is specific about the Orient. So that's one thing that I get from when I read this paragraph again that I didn't get before. The other thing that I get before, and this is just what I'm thinking right now, but it could just be hella wrong. What I'm thinking right now is what he's kind of doing with Gramsci is saying, if you are going to differentiate these two, and I haven't read Gramsci, so maybe Gramsci is also saying this. I'm not sure. I've read pieces of Gramsci, but I have not read it in a close way where I can really comment on this like this, right? But I'm doing my best. And actually, I have a friend who really inspired this. She inspired so every one of my friends and people I love inspired this in a different way, and I could pinpoint each way that somebody did. But one of my friends specifically really did, in that years ago we read Black Marxism together, and she really taught me more than anyone the beauty of reading like this. And she teaches Gramsci now at a university, so I would love to talk to her about this, and I might send this to her after. And I appreciate her and I love her so much. And I guess it's just stayed with me since then in a particular way. I had, of course, slow read, but to really slow read together, I had never done before. And so it was really nice. But that's to say that I should totally ask her about this now that I'm thinking about it. But what I see Said kind of doing here is sort of turning Gramsci in saying that the non-domination of this sort of civil, of these sort of voluntary affiliations still rely on an outward domination. So the thing that coheres the civil society and this political society together is the againstness of the Orient. That's how I'm kind of reading this now. So he's kind of turning Gramsci a little bit and radicalizing him a little bit in that way. And by radicalizing, I mean upping the sort of stakes of what he's saying. Okay. And so now that I've finished that paragraph, I'm actually going to take a little break because I'm just realizing I've been going for like over 2 hours. And when I come back, I'm just going to come back in 5 minutes. So what I usually do, but I didn't realize that it's been so long and I'm getting tired, is I play music. Like anyone who's watching me right now could just watch a chat and see what happened here. Video pause, continue watching, yes. Anyone who's watching can just recommend a song and I'll play it during the break. But I'm getting better at remembering that. So I have to also figure out how YouTube can not stop while I'm talking. That'd be nice. Because I like to have music in the background while I'm talking. But so I'll be back in 5 minutes. Sounds good? Okay.
Roja roja şiirle mağna
with us. 2 people in here right now. What we get to do now, while we're in a little break, is to check out how my dog Jamo's doing. Hi, Jamo. Let's see here. How you doing, sir? Let me try to open this back up again. Out. But then the thing is, like, once he's not out, he's really not out. You know what I mean? And did you see how his eyes were closed when I was with him? But now his eyes are just open and he's like looking, like he's just like he's just like, leave me alone, I'm sleeping. But he's actually like awake. It's like when you're a little kid and like your parents come in the room and you act like you're asleep. Alright, we're back and ready for Saïd. Okay. Where are we? This has been really fun so far, and actually really hard. Like, this part about Gramsci was really hard for me to get. And it's probably because I'm not that familiar with Gramsci, besides like just the basics. But also because I think he's doing something kind of important here, and so it just takes like a little bit of work to be able to like still be able to listen to him with the same level of attention. Okay, so I'm about to move on basically, and to see what he does with this. So far in this section, he's kind of offered that the Orient is an idea that's given its own life, its own sort of materiality, so to speak. What I mean by that, its own materiality, is like the idea has been given its own sort of like, I don't want to say personality, that's maybe not the right thing, but like it's been given its own history, it's been given its own like contours, it's been given its own vocabulary, it's like filled in, you know. So that's what I mean by that. But that we shouldn't let that fact be naturalized for us on all these levels. And the reason why this shit keeps being naturalized for us on all these levels, especially with regard to the Orient, and maybe when I recapitulate this in a different way, I'll understand it differently. But for now, the way I understand how this part connects to the previous parts is that he's saying the reason why, if you understand how power is working, you can see that the reason why this keeps happening is because not only is there a certain distribution of value which directs our attention by way of like power, the power he's talking about, but that Orientalism makes it so the Orient has a particular role in cohering all this shit. That's the way I understand that. So then he goes on to say, there is in addition the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness, usually overriding the possibility that a more independent or more skeptical thinker might have had different views on the matter. In a quite constant way, Orientalism depends for its strategy on this flexible positional superiority, which puts the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing him the relative upper hand. And I really, really love this sentence for a variety of reasons. I love this language of flexibility and flexible positionality, right? Because it's the way that, like, I feel like we think about power in the frame of a positionality a lot. You know, like, even the way that I have learned to talk about race is like a racial position, right? And I've been really trying to move away from that in my head. Like, my racial position is blank. And the reason is because, for me, a position connotes inertness, to use Saïd's term up here, when he said, at the beginning of this section, when he says, I have begun the assumption that the Orient is not an inert fact of nature. There's a certain fixity when I talk about, like, my racial position, for example. And so I love what he does with this word, positional, and it's flexible. Because, also, if I think about, like, a position in relation to another position, what I have then is let me just put it this way. Position, position. What I have then is that the fastest way or the most efficient way to interact between this position and this position is here. A straight line. So the method of engagement from one position to the other, if you think about power as a war between two positions, the method of engagement from position to position becomes fixed. And not only fixed, but universalized as the only possible method. But what you see, actually, what I get from this is that the way that Orientalism works is that it could be any series of positions. Orientalism could be any position. Any position at all. Because it's not, or it could be found in any positional relationship at all. And the reason for that is because Orientalism is not defined by the position. It's the process of, it's the paradigm of relation. So it's the way that position actually relates to the other position. Whatever position it is. What it reminds me of is what we were talking, and the way that it relates, right, is to make this thing stuck here. Fixed. Right? And so, like, it reminds me of what we were talking about on yesterday's stream about like, I was talking about, like, the philosopher Carl Schmitt, who's, like, the ideologue of Nazism. And, like, when I read some of the stuff he says, it's actually, like, the same word for word as, like, anti-fascist shit. Like, he's saying, like, but he's saying it in, like, the most fascist possible way, right? Like, he's saying, like, all politics needs the existence of the enemy. Basically, he's saying all politics is fascism, but he's saying, like, but yes, this is a good thing, so we should just embrace it. Right? But my point is, like, if his position is tied to his words, like, whatever his position is on the matter, so when we use, like, my position on the matter is blank as, like, my argument on it or my words about it, literally, he could have any possible position in that way. He could be saying anything, even the things that we say, because Orientalism is the way that he is using that position to relate to the Orient or to create an idea of reality. It's the way in which he naturalizes his position as universal or as reality or as the right way. So that's why I really love this language of, like, in a quite constant way, Orientalism depends for its strategy on this flexible positional superiority. So what we see is this war between positions, this relation of two positions, is just a strategy. It's not actually definitive of the thing. And the entire range of possible strategies, which is completely unquantifiable, or the way in which those strategies sort of are manifested, is Orientalism, in other words. And that's why it puts the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing him the relative upper hand. So that's how I understand the sentence personally. And I'm thinking about it for a second. Yeah, I think that's how I understand the sentence. But then he specifies, so let's go on. In a quite constant way, Orientalism depends for its strategy on this flexible positional superiority, which puts the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing him the relatively upper hand. And why should it have been otherwise? Okay, and why should it have been otherwise? Especially during the period of extraordinary European ascendancy from the late Renaissance to the present. The scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, or the soldier was in or thought about the Orient because he could be there, or could think about it, with very little resistance on the Orient's part. I'm going to keep reading and then I'm going to go sentence by sentence. I think this might be all one sentence. Under the general heading of knowledge of the Orient, and within the umbrella of Western hegemony over the Orient during the period from the end of the 18th century, there emerged a complex Orient suitable for study in the academy, for display in the museum, for reconstruction in the colonial office, for theoretical illustration in anthropological, biological, linguistic, racial, and historical theses about mankind and the universe, for instance, of economic and social theories of development, revolution, cultural personality, national or religious character. Okay. So, let's take this piece by piece. And why should it have been otherwise, especially during the period of extraordinary European ascendancy from the late Renaissance to the present? Okay. I'm going to look up late Renaissance when that was, because I don't really know. That's the honest truth. Okay. He's talking about the early, very early 15th century. So basically what he's talking about is since 1492. That's how I understand it. He's on Wikipedia it says 1520. So and 1492 is a significant date because this is when Columbus sails, the colonization of the New World begins, sort of racial slavery begins in the way that it's kind of characterized. It's like the beginning of the world that we have today, so to speak. This is the date that we kind of have for that. Okay, so this is what he's talking about basically. Why should it have been otherwise in this whole history of an idea of Europe? That's how I read that. In which this idea of Europe manifested as extraordinary European ascendancy, right? And I want to stop there for a second to really sit with this word ascendancy, and because I really like it, because we'll take a phrase like European ascendancy this is just like one of the things that like when I'm reading Said, I just like reflect on how much I love like his writing and his thought, because like already what we kind of find, even if we've just been reading this page, is that this phrase, which is so like normalized, European ascendancy, it actually like is so unsettled, because you can see that even the concept of ascendancy, of rising from something, is this sort of directionality that is constitutive of European violence, right? So it's pushing off from something in order to differentiate itself, and then you see like, ew, you know what I mean? And so even that phrase like becomes denormalized in a sense, and I really like that. So he's been really like sentences like this, when he kind of starts using like normal ways of talking about Europe or whiteness or a European way of being or whatever, you get to see like how deeply he's unsettled, like even the way that we can approach or think about this, right? But then he says, the scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, or the soldier was in or thought about the Orient because he could be there or could think about it with very little resistance on the Orient's part, right? And this sentence, well, I'm going to say one thing first, okay? When I see the word scientist here at the start, it reminds me of two things that I've said already. One of them is at the beginning of the second section, when I noticed, where is it? It was the word force that I wanted to find. It's not being over here. Okay, it was in qualification 2. When Said makes a second qualification, basically about this, what he said so far in this section, basically saying that we have to unsettle the idea that the way in which we think about these things is the way that we'll always be thinking about them, right? And he says, because they can't be studied without their force. And what I was kind of thinking at this point was that this word force, especially when it's talked about with regard to like what he starts with, that I have begun with the assumption that the Orient is not an inert fact of nature, he's sort of unsettling these concepts by which these ways in which we understand concepts that are also deeply tied up with the way that we learn the laws of motion in physics, right? So we get to see how like even science is a philosophy which is tied up in the same production of reality and truth he's talking about. And not only even science, right? And this is going to take me back to the acknowledgments. In the first line of the acknowledgments, in the first line of the acknowledgments of this book, Said tells us that he is writing this book with a science grant from Stanford, right? And so what I had said then is that when I see that, I really want to pay attention to the way in which the critique of science as a mode of truth making, or of making us, or of creating reality, is like woven into this whole thing, right? And so we can see it here. It's the first time where by name he has implicated the scientist as much as the missionary. And I think this is very interesting to me. But let me, in that regard, put together this list that he uses and try to see why he is listing this way, right? So scientist, scholar, missionary, trader, soldier. This is the list that he has, in which he's talking about all these people were in or thought about the Orient because they could be there with little resistance on the Orient's part, right? And for me, what I've been noticing when I've been looking at the way that Said lists these things, it's actually so woven into his argument because even the list has a certain movement about it. So a certain escalating of stakes, or a certain like echoing out into abstraction, or each following thing in the list, their chain, the chain that they're in is for a certain reason, right? And so the thing that I immediately notice about this list is that if we take from scientist to scholar to missionary to trader to soldier, what we see is that each of these successive things, each of these successive roles is more and more transparent in the way that they represent an ideology. That's the first thing that I feel. So a soldier, in a sense, is the most transparent in their commitment to representing an ideology, because they are fighting for, they are risking their life, so to speak, and fighting for it. A trader is, in the sense that they are representing something, not with their life necessarily, but with their wares, right? Missionary, in another sense, is almost a derogatory. Yesterday, I used the term missionary derogatorily to refer to the way that some people see themselves as scholars, because of what I was doing when I described it that way. Was I was trying to make more transparent the fact that they are attempting to propagandize knowledge without actually respecting the diversity of ideas. And so then you kind of see, like, I had just said that because I was giving an example. He hadn't used the word missionary yet. And so then you can see how missionary relates to scholar for him, right? Where scholar sort of becomes, we can really take scholar here, honestly, like the way I see that. I'm always going to keep going back to the way that he kind of positions like the word academic or scholar, even in the first definitions of Orientalism, right? So he's saying the first definition is an academic one. Anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient is an Orientalist. And what I was kind of feeling in that, and in the lines that followed it, in the arguments that followed it, is that what he's referencing is this idea of a scholar or an academic as having a certain role in this sort of civil society that Gramsci is talking about, where the scholar is the person who turns subjective ideas into ideas of truth. The place of the generating point from which these sort of like fluid ideas start solidifying, or their job is to solidify these sort of fluid ideas, right? So we can see like a very clear relationship between scholar and missionary here, for example. But in all of that, it's really interesting, because if we see the movement of, like, this is what I'm thinking now, like if I see the movement, and even if like you're just tuning in, for example, like even if all you did is look at this one line, you could see so much in just this one line, in just this list, right? Even in the movement from term to term to term to term to term. Because what you see then is, if the relationship between scholar and missionary, and between missionary and soldier, for example, skipping trader just for now, for the sake of the example. So these two relationships are like actually clear relationships in which we kind of understand the relationship between them, right? Like we like learn about the settlement of the United States, for example, and we see that there are missionaries and soldiers. And we can see that one of them is coming off as sort of more egalitarian, but they're both part of the same shit, fundamentally. The same settlership, right? And then we can also see between a scholar and a missionary. One of them, scholar, seems more egalitarian, but they're both kind of fundamentally on the same settlership, is what Saïd is saying. But then, this is the fucking crazy part of this, right? Scientist is the foremost example of that for him here. The foremost example of a sort of propagandizer of ideas that acts as if their ideas, their cause is egalitarian, but it's still caught up in the same shit. So that's why I really, really, really love this list a lot, and this way he phrases this, because you see, like in this moment, it's brought to the surface I mean, obviously, you have to think about it from Said's perspective. This is how I think about it, right? I have to think about it from Said's perspective. Like, he's sitting here writing this in Stanford with a science grant. Right? Like a grant from a Stanford Center for the Behavioral Sciences. So, in a way, he can't be like, fuck science all over this page. Maybe he can. I don't know. But in my head, he's looking for a way to weave a critique of science into the very heart of the argument, but in a way that's kind of covert, right? That's kind of how I think about it. In a way that sort of allows him to be able to to do that in this setting, right? So he's working within the constraints of like his setting, as he's saying we all do all the time, right? But so this critique of the scientist bangs so hard for me, even in the way that he just phrases it here, but especially in the context of the whole book, really. And why should it have been otherwise, especially during the period of extraordinary European ascendancy from the late Renaissance to the present? The scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, or the soldier was in or thought about the Orient because he could be there, or could think about it, with very little resistance on the Orient's part. Right? So, let's take this part by part. First of all, in terms of thinking about it, and in terms of being there on the one hand, and in terms of thinking about it on the other. And figure out how the fuck Said is feeling right now, because he seems like he is in a mood. But also, I should say that Said was probably in a mood really often. And I read somewhere, I don't remember where, that Orientalism, for him, like he described it as him being in a mood, I guess. Like him being in his feelings in a way that he had never been. And that out of that being in his feelings in a way that he had never been, Orientalism came out of it. So you can really see that, like, here, I guess. So what the fuck is Said saying here? Right? Why does he put could be there and could think about it separately? And what does he mean by resistance on the Orient's part? Very little resistance on the Orient's part. And where is being there? So these two things are tied to two different phrases. I love this song. I don't know if this is helpful for y'all in the chat who are watching me, but it's so helpful for me to kind of deconstruct a sentence like this, to really understand like the stakes of it and like how it's moving in itself. So all these settlers who have various degrees of transparency with regard to what they're doing and what their project is, all these settler careers were in or thought about the Orient because they could be there or they could think about it with very little resistance on the Orient's part. So the first thing I want to do is to think about the difference between the was in and the could versus the thought about, and how they relate to each other, and then what that has to do with the resistance. And so for me, I'm going to think about it for a sec. the thing that I am interested in is like the collapsing of the distinction between being in somewhere and thinking about it. And the first thing that I think of is it's a commentary for him on the sort of projection that thinking about it does. Right? And what I mean by that is... Sorry, I'm like OCD. Okay, there we go. What I mean by that is... In this first example, the way the book starts, this journalist on a visit to Beirut is looking at the terrible civil war around him, and he is there, technically. He's standing in Beirut. But it's almost as if the difference is so, like, blurry. Because is he actually there? Like, what does it mean to actually be there? Like, he's physically standing on the land. However, even as he's in the middle of the city, looking around, all he can do is project his thoughts. It's an object for thought right in front of him. And it's sort of the thing we were talking about thinking about the Orient. So what does it mean to be somewhere? And the word being, we should take that word really, for me, when I'm thinking about it now, I'm like, okay, we should take that word be with as much importance as it can, even though he's saying be there as a phrase. And the reason I'm saying that is because what we keep seeing is that he's talking about a sort of European way of being, a European style of being, in opposition to exotic beings right here, right? He's trying to characterize a European way of being or a European style of being. And so, how could he really be there? Or is his being there so different from his thinking about it? Because in fact, his being there is thinking about it. And about, I'm using that word too, in all the ways that I've been using that word. Where for Said, aboutness is sort of antithetical to withness. You can't really be with or within something if you can think about it as an object for thought. Or thinking about it as an object for thought is reducing that possibility in that moment. So, yeah. That's what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of this beginning part when I'm here. Was in or thought about, and what the difference is between those two. In a sense, that difference is kind of his whole thing, right? Because he's like, what was it? What does it mean? He's trying to pinpoint like kind of what period it was in the oscillation of Orientalism when actual contact between the Orient and the Occident in the form of colonization kind of happened, right? So in a sense, we can kind of see that when he's kind of holding these two together, was in because they could be there, thought about because they could think about it, we can see that this is another way of characterizing the whole sort of relationship between the manifestations of Orientalism in a particular moment. So basically, what's happening, at what point in the sort of oscillation of Orientalism they're at in a particular moment, and the paradigm altogether. Because he's like, in another way of saying that is he's trying to pinpoint the relationship between being there and thinking about it, and how being there is always circumscribed within the thinking about it, and how thinking about it is always a sort of way of being there. So that's how I read that personally. But then the second aspect of that sentence is the couldness of it. So they could be there, or they could think about it with very little resistance on the Orient's part, right? And the first thing that reminds me of is, again, this beginning, but like in a way that we didn't talk about before, where he says about this Orientalist who's just like standing in the middle of Beirut, like reflecting on his life and the nature of the universe, while like in the middle of everyone suffering, right? He's saying he was right about the place, of course, especially so far as a European was concerned. The Orient was almost a European invention and had been since antiquity a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories and landscapes, remarkable experiences. And so what I had thought when I read this sentence the first time is that for him, if we think about these haunting memories and landscapes and remarkable experiences together, the haunting memories and landscapes kind of, you can really see how the Orient kind of coheres an idea of time, an image of time unfolding for the European in this, right? Because it is the thing that's fixed as the past of whatever he's experiencing. But because of that, he also has an ability to go there and experience the unknown. So in other words, it also sort of signifies his access to a sort of future. And so that's what I think of when I see this couldness. That because of the Orient's sort of role in the coherence of an idea of time, he really could be there or could think about it, right? But also because there's very little resistance on the Orient's part in that sense, right? And so then this sort of very little resistance thing to me reminds me of what we talked about up here on the few pages ago. Where is it? And the conversation that I'm thinking of was in, here it is. The Orient was Orientalized not only because it was discovered to be Oriental in all those ways considered commonplace by an average 19th century European, but also because it could be, that is, submitted to being made Oriental. Okay, so we see the word could again here. So actually, it's not even that much of like a special connection that I'm making in my head. This is exactly the same sort of thing that he's talking about, right? He says could, and then he has submitting. It could be because the Orient submitted. In this one, it could be because the Orient has very little resistance. And what I was thinking in that sentence, which I think applies here too, is that we can read the submission or the little resistance as a sort of castigation of the Orient, or a sort of commentary on like what Orientals should or should not be doing, if we have already naturalized the idea of the Orient, which he has been warning against. That's why he warned against that in the first qualifier here. But if we remember to not identify with that thing Orient, and that the Orient is for the most part an idea, but not essentially an idea, or in other words, essentially an idea, but not totally an idea. If we remember that Orient here is an idea managed by the West, then you see that the reason why the Orient is always submitting, and the reason why the Orient has very little resistance is because actually the Oriental, so to speak, whatever brute reality, to use Saïd's word, of the Orient exists outside of that, has very little agency, or in a very tied down, very limited relationship, always managed relationship with that idea. And the way that I think about that as an example is like if I'm standing in front of fucking Flaubert, what can I say to Flaubert? What can I do to Flaubert? And Flaubert is a French writer who Said was citing as an example of an Orientalist writer earlier in the work. What could I do or say to Flaubert that would resist the idea, the Orientalist relationship that he already has with me? What could I do that would subvert the idea in a way that would undermine that ideas or the Orientalism's spread and breadth in the way he thinks and the way he is? Pretty much nothing. And everything. But you know what I mean? So when I think about that, like lack of ability, or like an even more central example, I think of like, if I am like the other Iraqi who's like sitting in Iraq during the occupation, right? And these US soldiers have been being taught about the Iraqi mind and shit like that in all their training, and then they go and they storm Iraq and they're occupying it. What, as an Iraqi, if I have not been here in the US already, if my family has not already come to the US, if I am in there still, what could I say to that soldier that would change his idea of me? When the idea has a flexible positional superiority. I don't know where that is. Oh, it's right here. Where no matter what I say, it's already accounted for that. Because it's not just like a specific concept. It's a way of relating to me. It's already so it's a way of relating to me that then already determines any possible method of engagement with me. So that's what I take when I read. That's what I read when I read this discussion about very little resistance on the Orient's part. That's how I read that. This idea is already managed self-referentially. I'm going to delete all this stuff. See, this music just cuts off. It's so frustrating. I don't know how to do this with YouTube so it doesn't cut off. Or I guess I have to download all these songs and put them in my iTunes. I literally don't know. Yeah. So let's keep going. Where am I? Under the general heading, here, I'm going to read this. Under the general heading of knowledge of the Orient, and within the umbrella of Western hegemony over the Orient, during the period from the end of the 18th century, there emerged a complex Orient suitable for study in the academy, for display in the museum, for reconstruction in the colonial office, for theoretical illustration in anthropological, biological, linguistic, racial, and historical theses about mankind and the universe, for instances of economic and sociological theories of development, revolution, cultural personality, national or religious character. So this sentence is going to be fun. I'm just like bracing myself for it. Okay. Under the general heading of knowledge of the Orient. Okay. So this is really interesting, right? Because he has another sort of parallel that he makes. And one of them is knowledge of the Orient, and the other one is hegemony over the Orient. And I think this relationship between these two is so fucking revealing of the point of what he's trying to always be teaching us, right? And so I'm gonna take my time with this. Okay, so on the one hand we have knowledge over the Orient, knowledge of the Orient, and on the one hand we have hegemony over the Orient. And for me, when I read this, we can really, really, really start to see like the relationship between an idea of knowledge and between the persistence of power, right? And the persistence of Orientalism. And so I think there was a point where he had talked about knowledge before. See? Up here. I even highlighted it. A few pages earlier, at the end of his third qualification, in which he's trying to get us to unsettle the reality of the paradigm of Orientalism itself. He says, continued investment made Orientalism as a system of knowledge about the Orient, an accepted grid for filtering through the Orient into Western consciousness. And so knowledge here is so tied up with what is already accepted. We can really start to see him just reinforcing over and over and over again how the sort of the thing that just makes things accepted is the and I'm going to use his term up here, result of cultural hegemony at work. Cultural hegemony, and the result of cultural hegemony at work gives Orientalism the durability and the strength he's been speaking about. So the thing that sort of dominates or dictates the way that a culture develops is the same thing that coheres subjective ideas into an idea of knowledge. Something that is factually true, that is true no matter what. That's hella interesting to me. So basically, the process of power and of domination is, on the other hand, the process by which that power and domination is just turned into a thing called reality. That's how I take those two things together. But within all this, since the end of the 18th century, this period that he's studying, there emerged a complex Orient suitable for study in the academy. For display in the, and he lists this whole ass thing out. So what I'm going to do now is, and I'm just interested to see, so there's one person here with me, you're going to have fun with me in this. I'm going to just do this whole ass, giant ass list and see what comes out of it. Because I want to understand what he's talking about within the context of this comparison. We have this on this side. Study in the academy. Display in the museum. And actually, I'm just going to take out the so I have more room here. Display in museum. Deconstruction in colonial. In office. Um, What's up, Ihabo? Welcome to the chat. Right now what we're doing is we are going to deconstruct this whole giant ass list that Saïd has here. Theories of mankind and the universe. Theories of development. Okay. Let's see. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, we got it. We're down here. Check this out, y'all. So if we remember, we had a different list here, right, which he had just said, where he's talking about the scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, or the soldier was in or thought about the Orient because he could be there or could think about it. And what I had been thinking about this sentence, which I'll just rewrite now because I think it's probably really beneficial to have it next to this one. Scholar, missionary, trader, soldier. And I also want to just talk about it again since we have a new person in the chat. Scholar, missionary, trader, soldier. It's always just helpful. Scientist, scholar, missionary, trader, soldier. What he's trying to do here is to show a movement by which the whole of this thing called society is actually we learn to we learn to think of it as a sort of transparency, and what that means is we learn to think of it as something which there's no outside of. But actually, all of these roles of people are propagandizers of ideology, of a certain ideology. But all of them, to a more or less degree, are less or more or less transparent about the fact that this is an ideology instead of a truth. Right? So on the one end, we have a sort of soldier who's the most transparent about their relationship to the sort of ideology, right? Because they're living and dying for it. On the other hand, like we have a trader, but then we have a mission. I'm just going over it a little bit quicker because we already went over it. We have a sort of missionary who, if you hold the missionary and the soldier together, this is the example that I gave before. Let's say in a settler context, let's say in the context of like in my school, I learned about, so this is actually the best example. In my elementary school, I learned about, the missionaries and the soldiers. And even in the more liberal ways that I learned about it, in my school, I learned that the missionary settlers were the good ones and the soldier settlers were the bad ones. But what I actually saw, what was actually being the difference between these two actually, was just the amount of transparency they had around actually what they were doing. Because they were both fundamentally part of the same settler shit, but the missionary kind of feels more egalitarian in comparison to the soldier. But it's not actually an essential difference between them. They're both propagandizing an ideology at the expense of a diversity of thinking and a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of modes of life. So it's fundamentally a sort of variations within a settler society, or within a settler way of being. And on the opposite side of that from the soldier is the scientist, who is convinced that the ideology they are propagandizing is the truth. But in actuality, science is as much of an ideology as any of the ideology that the others are kind of putting forth, right? And so the whole kind of book is Saïd unsettling us from this idea of reality in the things that we've already accepted. Right? And so what we see here then is that the Orient's role in all that, we're talking about the Orient's role in all that here, right? Under the general heading of knowledge of the Orient and within the umbrella of Western hegemony over the Orient, during the period from the end of the 18th century, which is the period of sort of a more overt colonial apparatus, more overt colonialism, there emerged a complex Orient suitable for all of this stuff, right? Study in academy, display in a museum, reconstruction of colonial office, theories of mankind and the universe, theories of development, economic and social development, right? And the reason I think the first thing that I think when I see this sort of list, and I'm trying to think like, how do these things relate to each other? Because as we can see, even thinking about this list really helps us to realize like the implications of what Said is trying to teach us, right? What we see here is that there is a relationship between all of these to the next one, but they're in cycles with each other. That's the first way that I start to see this. That's the first way that I think about this. So for me, like, okay, so I have a friend who used to say like, I really love this. It's one of my favorite things that he's ever said. He said, the academy is where knowledge goes to die, where the museum is where art goes to die. So for him, these two are parallel kind of institutions for him. And I think maybe in our reading of Said, we can kind of twist that a little bit into thinking the academy is where knowledge is where ideas go to become knowledge in their dying, right? Because what Said keeps trying to say is that knowledge, even to think that there's something called knowledge, is to think that these things are just universally true. But there's nothing that's universally true. This is all ideology. And so you can kind of see these two things next to each other. And when I read these, I think of that parallel, like right away, right? So how study in the academy, like related to display in a museum. And the thing that I think of when I see that is like both of them are sort of writing something into like stillness or into like facticity. Right? Like writing a sort of idea into stillness or facticity. And so when art is displayed in a museum, that is when it really starts becoming like part of the idea of art, right? Even though like artisticness and poetics is a way of being in the world, a way of orienting yourself to the world. It cannot be contained in a museum or defined or anything like that. Just like ideas can't be contained or defined, but they are in the academy. So these things are like really together for me. And then this, for me, is the sort of extrapolation off of that. So reconstruction in a colonial office for me, when I think about it, the first thing that I think of is how these sort of institutions, like a colonial office for me is like a government building. It's not that much different for me, to be honest. Like, well, it's not different at all, you know. But like what Said has been talking about a lot is how like these institutions also reproduce these things, right? So for me, it's like the place where these things are sort of becoming fact and the place where they are getting propagandized out as fact. And then we see a sort of cycle again. The place where theories of facts, and then we have theories of facts, and theories of how to propagandize them out as facts. So we do see a movement again in two cycles. And when we see two cycles like this, as opposed to one cycle here, we can really see the way he sees Orientalism as a sort of infinite cycle of, or infinite sort of expansion and retraction of a settler society or a settler field, a field of settlerness. Where there's sort of so sort of this, for me, like this whole list is right here. And this whole list is right here again. So it's a sort of doubling of it, and so you can see how the first time he lists out, he does it once, and the second time he lists out, he does it twice. So it's even a sort of expansion of the cycling in the way that he develops the idea. It's so fucking cool to me. But you can really see the way he's thinking about Orientalism as a sort of infinite system of approaches and retractions. Approaching the Orient, retracting from the Orient. And it's always within this sort of trying to understand, if we can understand how the West approached the Orient, the idea of the Orient, at the end of the 18th century, during this colonization period, we can understand, because it's cyclical, how the Orient is approaching, how the West is approaching the Orient today, after 67, in the occupation of Palestine. So for me, like, that's how I read this this paragraph so far. That's how I read this part. But I want to go back and sort of read it again now from the beginning to there, and then move on, so we can kind of see, because we kind of did such like a specific analysis of it. I really want to see like how that changes how I read it altogether. In a quite constant way, up here. In a quite constant way, Orientalism depends for its strategy on this. Actually, I'm going to start one sentence back, so we don't get lost. We can see the flow of the ideas and how Said feels about this. There is, in addition, the hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, themselves reiterating European superiority over Oriental backwardness, usually overriding the possibility that a more independent or more skeptical thinker might have had different views on the matter. In a quite constant way, Orientalism depends for its strategy on this flexible positional superiority, which puts the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient without ever losing him the relative upper hand. And why should it have been otherwise, especially during the period of extraordinary European ascendancy from the late Renaissance, which is really the beginning of an idea of Europe, to the present? The scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, or the soldier, and so we talked about from most transparent to least transparent, or however way you want to phrase that, was in or thought about the Orient because he could be there. So this cycle of all these different Orientalists were in the Orient because they could be there or think about it with very little resistance on the Orient's part. Under the general heading of knowledge of the Orient, and within the umbrella of Western hegemony over the Orient, during the period from the end of the 18th century, there emerged a complex Orient suitable for study in the academy, for display in the museum, for reconstruction in the colonial office, for theoretical illustration in anthropological, biological, linguistic, racial, and historical theses about mankind and the universe, for instances of economic and sociological theories of development, revolution, cultural personality, national or religious character. And so one thing, actually, when I'm reading this back again, that I've learned in retrospect, is that it actually reminds me of what he talks about earlier in the book, when he says, let's find it. Let's see where it is. Let's try a different thing. Let's try this. Here we go. So this actually reminds me of this part on page 2 where he says, he's talking about what the Orient's special role is in a European way of being. And he says, The Orient has helped to define Europe or the West as this contrasting image, idea, personality, experience. Yet none of the Orient is merely imaginative. The Orient is an integral part of European material civilization and culture. Orientalism expresses and represents that part, culturally and even ideologically, as a mode of discourse with all of these things. Right? And so what I get from this sentence, from this earlier part that he's talking about, is that the part of similarity that the Orient has with a sort of European way of being will be represented, but the part that's not similar will be kicked off from, like kicking off from the edge of a pool when you're swimming. And that part left behind is sort of also as necessary as the part that needs to be expressed. There always needs to be difference being produced, right? But the fields, like these modes of discourse, when he says modes of discourse, all these modes of discourse that represent that part that Europe shares with the Orient, that's what this part reminds me of over here. All of these things, biology, linguistics, racial and historical theses about mankind and the universe, anthropology, theories of development, revolution, national or religious characters, all of these aspects of what we think are a world, and we just naturalize them as these things of the world, they're all fields of Orientalism. And the reason is because all of them are happening within a certain paradigm of a way of being that all needs to kick itself off from a certain part of the Orient in order to understand itself as all the same thing. So in other words, the way I read this is like the way that we can just implicitly know that anthropology, biology, linguistics, history, theories of mankind and the universe, the way that we know that all those things just work together is because at some deep level, we know that all of those things are part of the same paradigm that is different than the Orient. Okay, and I'm going to keep going. Where am I? So that's how I read that. And then he goes on. Additionally, the imaginative examination of things Oriental was based more or less exclusively upon a sovereign Western consciousness out of whose unchallenged centrality an Oriental world emerged. First, according to general ideas about who or what was an Oriental, then according to detailed logic governed not simply by empirical reality, but by a battery of desires, repressions, investments, and projections. Okay, so for me, like, this is such an interesting sentence. Like, it's such a fucking interesting sentence. And the reason is because I think, like, each of these qualifiers is a subtweet on, like, something that we thought was just, like, essential. And he's like, nah, all of this shit is caught up in Orientalism. But also because, like, a lot of the words and the terminology that he uses here are kind of things that I think have been being hinted at before, but they're not, but now they're being kind of said. Right? So the first thing that I notice in this sentence, like if I want to just like really read it and kind of figure out like how Said is thinking about it, right? The first thing that I notice in this sentence is, first of all, it's the additionally. So what he's about to say is separate from what he said before, or it just adds to it, but it's not a recapitulation of what he said before. And in the last paragraph, he said something similar, right? In the last paragraph, he had there is an addition. The hegemony of European ideas about the Orient, etc., etc., etc. And what I had thought about this is that the way that this in addition sentence relates to what's previous is that on the one hand, he's talking about Orientalism creates a hierarchy of values. It's a way of kind of constituting reality, which is a hierarchy of values where things that are closer to the idea of Europe are valued more, and non-European things are valued less. That's one aspect. Whereas the ways in which that happens, that value gets transported, happens through these specific sort of ideas, like biology, linguistics, racial. So biology is a method of Orientalism, for example. Anthropology is a method of Orientalism, for example. Linguistics is a method of Orientalism, for example. They're methods of carrying out the same hierarchy of value. So that's one way that I had understood this distinction in this part. And the other way is that in addition, the role of Oriental backwardness is what makes the Orient sort of specific, even in the context of these non-Europeans that he's talking about. And so those are the two ways that I had understood his kind of in addition in the previous paragraph, and he does it again. So let's see if it's a sort of similar way of parsing out an argument that he's making in two paragraphs in a row, right? And I'm just going to write that. Actually, no. So yeah, I'm going to go on. So I already see a sort of similarity, because here he's talking about the hierarchy of sort of value in itself, and here he's talking about the examination of these things. Right? So what is the examination of things Oriental do now? So what is the carrying out of these sort of things do? But it's based, and so then he says, it's based more or less exclusively on a sovereign Western consciousness out of whose unchallenged centrality an Oriental world emerged. Okay, so I always want to stop there for a second and take this, because this is like very huge sentences. And for me, it's just so fucking hard to like actually follow him. Like I can follow the sort of words of the sentence and get meaning from them. But what he's been saying the whole time, right, is the way that we're getting meaning generally is fucked up. The way that we make meaning out of things. So I want to try to like make meaning, try to keep the meaning that I'm making from it as close to the way that he's making meaning from it. And the way that I feel like I need to do that is by really paying attention to the way that his ideas are flowing in and out of one another. And so this sentence that's all to say that this sentence is, this part is really fucking hard. Okay. And so I'm just going slowly through it. So when he says based more or less exclusively on a sovereign Western consciousness, what that makes me think of, like when he says sovereign here, what that makes me think of, first of all, when I see Western consciousness, I think of like the way of being, the European way of being that he's been talking about. But when he says a sovereign Western consciousness, what I think about with that word is like a certain freedom that it has, right? And that reminds me of like how he started this section again, about how the idea of a sort of freedom that a Western consciousness has is always kind of predicated on a sort of inertness that the Orient has. And what that means for me is like a stillness that the Orient has, a fixedness, like it's caged or trapped. And so that's what that makes me think of, like, first of all, when I'm reading that. And I think that's what he means by that. So when I think of sovereign here, I still think of like the movement that he's discussing, honestly. And the freedom of movement that he's discussing, honestly. But out of that sort of freedom of movement, okay, so then actually let me put it this way. This freedom of movement has a sort of unchallenged centrality to him, right? And so my next question is like, what does unchallenged centrality mean? And the unchallengedness, I think he's kind of been talking about in what we've been talking about because like I think what we've been reading so far, like when he says there's very little resistance on the Orient's part, he's kind of saying that like it's unchallenged, right? This is the way I read this. It's unchallenged because it's a management of an idea that the actual, whatever actual thing it represents is only very tangentially involved in, right? But also that it's central to that sort of idea, right? And so I actually want to stop for a second and to talk about like this idea of centrality and like how much this is like so deeply tied into the same sort of shit we've been talking about movement and inertness, and especially what he talked about at the beginning on the first page when he says that so the Orient's special place in European Western experience is because of the Orient's adjacency to Europe, right? And so in the mind of that adjacency, I want to take that adjacency like really seriously with what he's saying about, where was I? About centrality, and just think about those things together for a second. So on one hand, if we look at like, actually, you know what? I'm just going to do this. Okay. This is the world's shittiest map. Okay, we're not going to use this map. Actually, let me just do this. It's even easier. Muslim world. Because this is actually right in what Said is talking about, right? Okay. So let's take, like, let's say this as an example, right? It's the Muslim world map from Wikipedia. And we can really start seeing what he's talking about Oriental world too. So that's why I like this, right? As the idea of Europe is like forming, or a European way of being is forming, what we've been talking about is, Said is saying that kind of the central thing about this, about the central role that the Orient has to play, is, in a sense, it's adjacency, right? And what its adjacency means is that it's literally surrounding Europe. Right? And so in a sense, if the Orient is adjacent to Europe, then Europe is at the center of its own understanding of being, right? Because what Said is saying here on this first page of this of this book, is that it's not only adjacent to Europe. That's not just the issue. The issue is that it's adjacent to Europe, but also it's the place of Europe's greatest and richest, oldest colonies, the source of its civilizations and languages, its cultural contestant. So in other words, it's very easy to look at this and to already assume that these are essentially different civilizations, because that is the entire fundamental basis of the propaganda of this, right? But actually, this is a history that it's telling for itself, that it has grown out of, like, Mesopotamia and, like, Egypt, ancient Egypt, and, like, you know, in a variety of ways, like the Maghreb here, right? It's grown out of these places. It's grown out of, like, Anatolia and Turkey and whatever this place, right? It's grown out of these places. So in the history that it tells for itself, this is the point in its past that it has sort of grown into, right? Grown out of. And so then we see that its anxiety is always to be reinforcing the fact that it is different than this part around it. And the way that it is different is that this shit is fixed, is the past of it. So it recognizes itself, it coheres a concept called history, which is just a made up concept. by asserting that its own differences are a sort of movement forward in this thing called time from this place. But it's really just accentuating the differences. And that's why Said says that part that's similar is what's represented as Europe. Right? But I'm saying that all to say that what we can actually see also is this whole language we also have about any way of understanding difference, right? Centrality versus marginality. Marginalized peoples. We got to bring marginalized peoples into the center. All of these ways of understanding difference and power and how it's imbricated with difference is straight from fucking Orientalism. Like, and not Orientalism the book. Orientalism, the way this shit works. I'm going to return to this PDF now so we can go back into like actually seeing what this means. It's on page 8. So what we're doing when we even talk, like, so you can see this language of like centrality, we gotta bring things that are marginal into the center, etc. This is us replicating the paradigm of difference by which Europe literally understood itself in relation to the Orient. And this becomes the model by which difference is even discussed. But not only that, you start to really see the apparatus of like how this sort of infinite settlerness of being is working, right? Because what's happening is the Europe understands itself as the thing at the center that's constantly kicking itself off from and drawing from this thing around it. And as those things, you can imagine that as, and Said calls it a system of approaches and retraction. Well, he says approaches, and I'm saying retractions on the other side. And with each approach, you see that the Europe, which is at the center, sort of gains something from it. That's how I'm reading this, right? It gains an understanding of self from it. And Said literally uses that term too, where he says, I don't know why this it's just because this PDF is old, but like this shit, like, it's so bad at finding words here. But here it is, actually. I found the sentence anyway, right? So he even says, European culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off against this Orient as a surrogate and underground self, right? But okay, you can imagine that as this thing, as it oscillates into the Orient, it gains from it and then retracts itself back. And these things from the margins are pulled into the center. So you can really see, like in the study of Orientalism, how the way we spatialize difference in our head is so deeply entrenched in the production of difference that he's calling Orientalism. And so even like the lesson that I get from this, from Said, is like even when I am talking about like difference as marginality, like something is on the margins, even when I'm assuming that that there is a thing called margins, right? There's a thing called being a marginal identity or a marginalized identity or whatever. Without challenging that already, what I have actually done then is I've sort of replicated this like mode of understanding in which there's also something at the center and there's something at the margin. And what I'm actually advocating for then is for a sort of the thing at the margin to be pulled into the center. But without challenging the idea of the center, what I have actually, and the margin itself, what I've actually done now is actually just propagandized for part of the movement of Orientalism. Or part of the movement by which things are trapped into making meaning, in other words, by which reality is manifested. So what I've actually done now is I've just propagandized for the same sort of thing that I think that I'm fighting against, by fighting for people at the margins or whatever. So what I'm going to do now is actually like, so what this reminds me of actually is like I've been reading this book by Edouard Glissant, and he has like a really beautiful like way of talking about like marginality, and I really wanted to just bring it in because that's what it reminded me of, basically. Uh, this sentence about unchallenged centrality. He has such a beautiful way of talking about marginality, and let me see if I can find it. There's so much similarities between this book and that book, that when I'm looking for this, I'm just seeing like so many different places where like I could read and it would speak so much with this. But actually, I know I actually took a picture of this, so I'm gonna of this passage that I'm looking for, so I'm gonna read it. But what I'm gonna do also is just read another passage that I just found that I think is like so speaks so much with this. And Glissant says here in this book, I'm just gonna read it because I think it's interesting with this sentence. The West is where this is where okay. Center and periphery are equivalent. Conquerors are the moving, transient root of their people. The West, therefore, is where this movement becomes fixed, and nations declare themselves in preparation for their repercussions in the world. This fixing, this declaration, this expansion, all require that the idea of the root gradually take on an intolerant sense that people mean to challenge. I'm just replacing it so it makes it more like readable. But you see, like, he's even really saying the same shit in a sense. But then there's this other phrase that I really liked from that, or this other part that I really liked from that. And you know what? I actually know exactly where it is. One second, let me find it. He's talking about, so Glissant is talking about like what can happen if we let go of these ideas of marginality and centrality. And he says, in the third stage, the trajectory is abolished. The arrow-like projection becomes curved. The poet's word leads from periphery to periphery, and yes, it reproduces the track of circular nomadism. That is, it makes every periphery into a center. Furthermore, it abolishes the very notion of center and periphery. I really love that. So I think that is like fundamentally different from even a discussion about marginality. But that's all really to say, that's what I think of when I read this sentence, and what I read when Saïd says, is talking about unchallenged centrality. But out of the unchallenged centrality, when he says out of an unchallenged centrality, an Oriental world emerges, we can understand that like the idea of an Oriental world, what he's talking about, is like such like a fundamental product of this violence. And if you don't challenge the notion of a center, then what you have done is you have recreated the need for a world at the margin, which in like the idea of a world itself is an Oriental world, right? And so like what this also reminds me of, for example, this sentence here, is like when I was younger, I think that I had like so much, like I did so much activisms around like, so much of my activism was around like naming and like what this place that I came from was called. Like, is it like, so Saïd calls it the Orient, but that's considered a bad term now, right? But is it like the MENA region? Is it like the Swana region? Is it like Middle East and North Africa? You know, some people don't like that because they say like, you know, like this is like in reference to the West or whatever. And I think actually now in my life, the most accurate term that is in use today in terms of describe, because in reality, we wouldn't want any terms to reference this geography, right? Is what I learned now. But if I'm thinking about accuracy in terms of describing the way that like power delineates that, the most accurate one is a Muslim world. When people say Muslim world. And the reason why I feel that way is because it's a world that is created at the same time that a world is created out of an idea of Europe. And the thing that differentiates specifically is Islam, in comparison to the way that Europe develops out of Christendom. So that's what I think of when I read this sentence. And then when he says, first according to general ideas about who or what was an Oriental, then according to a detailed logic governed not simply by empirical reality, but by a battery of desires, repressions, investments, and projections. The first thing that I think of when I read that is like he's differentiating between like the general idea that we've been talking about. First, according to the general idea that I've been talking about in his words, then according to like all these different subfields and methods and logics. All these logics are products of the same thing, right? So like, for example, when I talk about the stream being like an attempt to read outside of capitalist logics of reading. And what I mean by that is like, no matter, even if I read Marx, if I'm still thinking of reading as a way to like extract a product out of the book, then I'm actually not gaining anything from Marx, right? And so what he's saying is like, all these logics that we have are first kind of constituted by these general ideas and then distributed into these logics. That's how I kind of read that personally. It's a really, really difficult sentence, and I guess that's why it took me like an hour to figure out. But that's the way that I understand this sentence. Yeah, and so, okay. And I'll just say one thing about this, which is that when he says battery of desires, repressions, investments, and projections, that reminds me of like this part earlier when he, in I think it's qualification 2, in the second qualification, or no, in his first qualification in this section, when he's talking about the epigraph to the book, right? The East is a career. And he says what I think he means by career is that it's like this all-consuming passion. This thing that makes it so hot as an object for thought. And so that's what I think of when I see him say like with desires, repressions, investments, and projections. But I will say one thing which I don't have to go into, but especially in his previous book called Beginnings, which is right here. I just always like to show it because it's a beautiful book. Saïd has a really, really, really long and in-depth conversation with Sigmund Freud, who is like the founder of like psychoanalysis, so to speak. And even by the end of this book, we see that this whole book is very deeply like engaged with Freud in that way. And the way that he really engages with him is Freud's distinction between like this thing in itself and the manifestations of it that he's been talking about with Orientalism. That's Freud's distinction, right? But so I think that we can really read this as a sort of subtweet of Freud, because he's saying that like for Freud, like these desires and repressions and projections are like the paradigm in itself. And he's saying like, no, these are all methods or like logics within this paradigm called Orientalism. So as I've said, I try not to like go into like other theorists because I try to like really stick to this and make it accessible even if you haven't read anyone else. But I just want to offer that I think that's what's going on. For anyone who does have an investment in that or who knows that or wants to read more, you can reach out to me and I'll hook you up with like resources and literature and all this stuff. But I do think that this is a subtweet here. And for reasons of just being making of like the ethics of this stream that I care about, I'm not going to like go into like a discussion of like its subtweetness. I don't think, because I don't really want to do that. And then so we have a closing out of this paragraph, right? If we can point to great Orientalist works of genuine scholarship, like Sasi's, I'm not going to say this because I'm not going to embarrass myself on the stream. Like these works of great great scholarship. My best friend, when I read with her, she makes me pronounce all of these French titles. And let me get some subscribers first before I do that. Okay. So if we can point to these great Orientalist works of genuine scholarship, we need to also note that Renan's and Gobineau's racial ideas came out of the same impulse, as did a great many Victorian pornographic novels. See the analysis by Stephen Marcus of The Lustful Turk. Okay. The Lustful Turk, what he's referencing here, is this like famous, I forget if it's a story or play. I read it like a few years ago. It's basically like a harem, sort of harem story. About this like Oriental man who just has this harem and he's like threatened. It's actually really interesting in a different sense. But in this like white fantasy, this like Oriental man is like deeply threatened by like, I forget actually. But anyway, there's like a relationship between the Oriental man and a black man that's in the story, which is like very central to the story. And it's just like really interesting to see how Orientalism is kind of functioning as a mode of anti-blackness in this story. So that's like, I forget the details of that, but it's a really interesting story if you ever want to check it out. And so, okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read this whole paragraph back now that we're done. And then I'm going to take a break and I'm going to finish the rest of this. In a quite constant way, I'm starting right up here, and let's see, and I'm really interested to see if you feel like, whoever's watching right now, feels like it hits different, because for me, it always does, but, okay. In a quite constant way, Orientalism depends for its strategy on this flexible positional superiority, which puts the Westerner in a whole series of possible relationships with the Orient, without ever losing him the relative upper hand. And why should it have been otherwise, especially during the period of extraordinary European ascendancy from the late Renaissance to the present? The scientist, the scholar, the missionary, the trader, or the soldier was in or thought about the Orient because he could be there, or could think about it, with very little resistance on the Orient's part. Under the general heading of knowledge of the Orient, and within the umbrella of Western hegemony over the Orient, during the period from the end of the 18th century, there emerged a complex Orient suitable for study in the academy, for display in the museum, for reconstruction in the colonial office, for theoretical illustration in anthropological, biological, linguistic, racial, and historical theses about mankind and the universe, for instances of economic and sociological theories of development, revolution, cultural personality, national or religious character. Additionally, the imaginative examination of things Oriental was based more or less exclusively upon a sovereign Western consciousness, out of whose unchallenged centrality an Oriental world emerged. First according to general ideas about who or what was an Oriental, then according to a detailed logic governed not simply by empirical reality, but by a battery of desires, repressions, investments, and projections. That sentence definitely feels so different to me now that I've spent time with it. I really understand it in a whole different way, I think. If we can point to a great Orientalist works of genuine scholarship, we need to also note, and these are like academic works, like for example, account of the manners and customs of the modern Egyptians, we also need to note that Renan's and Gobineau's racial ideas came out of the same impulse, as did a great many pornographic novels. Wow, thanks Boogaloo Shrimp for hitting with the song, even though I forgot again. Alright, so that's the paragraph, and we are going to take a break, basically, and get back into it. for the final sort of push through the end of this section 2. All right, y'all. In this break, we can just hang out with my dog again. This is a very interesting and topical song for the stuff we've been discussing. I don't know if that was on purpose, but very clever. Now y'all see like my YouTube interests. It's like Frasier and Gordon Ramsay. Let's see how my dog Jammer is doing. Hey Jammer, what's up? What's up, my friend? How are you? I'll put this on as a Jammer cam. You're such a good boy. Here. I'm gonna put this on as a Jammer cam so you can see it. Okay, I'm gonna go. Now I'm gonna All right, y'all. How was the Jamel Cam? I hope it was good. I hope you got a lot of beautiful stuff from it. Oh, it looks like in the chat that, or in the video, that you can only see his butt. That is unfortunate. But you got to see him for a little bit, right? I'm getting better at this, you know? It's my 4th day of streaming. It feels like longer, but it's just my 4th day. Okay, so yeah. Even like the title of a song like this, and I really appreciate the recommendation, Boogaloo Shrimp. Like, it's so far beyond, like, I don't give a fuck if it's like a racist title or whatever. Like, I don't even think about it like that. Like, because I don't even think at some point it's like that. Like, it's my one of my mentors calls it like a representational critique, to be like, this thing is racist. I remember we can see like what the limitations of that are, even in Saïd's conversation about representation, right? But it's really interesting to think, like, what does it mean that like so many songs, like from the Muslim world, have titles like that, like A Place Forgotten by Time? What does that mean, like, in the context of what Saïd is talking about? Like, is it like a place? Is it like that part of the Orient that Saïd says has a brute reality that exceeds the West? Most of the time, the West's representation of it. If most of the time the West is like a signifier of time or history itself, then is it like a sort of reflecting a sort of tendency to want to expand into that part that hasn't been found yet? It's just like a bunch of questions. I don't know. It's interesting. But that was a great song. Thanks. Yeah, it was really cool. Okay. So he's just said all this. And now he says, and yet one must repeatedly ask oneself. Wait, I'm going to read to here. And yet one must repeatedly ask oneself whether what matters in Orientalism is the general group of ideas overriding the mass of material, about which who could deny that they were shot through with doctrines of European superiority, various kinds of racism, imperialism, and the like, dogmatic views of the Oriental as a kind of ideal and unchanging abstraction, or the much more varied work produced by almost uncountable individual writers, whom one would take up as an individual instances of authors dealing with the Orient. So what does this mean? Let's take out this middle part first, because I'm struggling. And yet, one must repeatedly ask oneself whether what matters in Orientalism is the general group of ideas overriding the mass of material, or the much more varied work produced by almost uncountable individual writers, whom one would take up as individual instances of authors dealing with the Orient. Okay, so the first thing that I think about this is that, so there's the kind of binary being set up, right? And I think we can see, like, for me, like when I've been reading this book, I feel like Saïd really often sets up binaries, which he wants to keep showing you, like what I was talking about like the progressive versus the limit, like the tendency that wants to expand versus the tendency that wants to limit, like as an example of like liberals and conservatives being, or like left and right being fundamentally sort of the same thing for Saïd, fundamentally underneath the same sort of ideology underneath, or system of ideologies, network of interests, as he says. I've noticed that the way he thinks, he does this a lot. You can see him working out the thing that he's talking about in his head, right? So in another sense, what this sentence kind of makes me think of is Saïd, a lot of what he's trying to say, and this reminds me of like what he was saying up here in his third qualification. One ought never to assume that the structure of Orientalism is nothing more than a structure of lies or myths which, were the truth about them to be told, would simply blow away. So it seems like so much of the work that he's trying to do is to show how the creation of binaries in which one side of the binary has value and the other side of the binary doesn't. For example, good and bad, even to that simple level. And in the previous stream, I think we discussed it as like Denise Ferreira da Silva, whose book is right here, discusses it as like the horizon of life and death, for example, in a similar way. But like these ideas, life and death, good and bad, they kind of become the underneath of a sort of way of conceptualizing things in binaries, where one half of the binary has value and is important and is good, I guess. So you can't even describe it outside of the language. And one half of the binary is bad or valueless, right? And so what he keeps trying to show is that the maintenance of that border is like so central to Orientalism. And so you can literally see him all the time in the way he's thinking and the way he's feeling. And this is something I really love about him and why I think he's such a good teacher for me. Because in a way that I feel when I'm reading the sentence, he's very honest. What I mean by that is, he doesn't go through the thought process in his head and then present it to you as if he's a finished product. He takes you through the fucked up way that he thought about it, and then he shows you the process by which he's unlearning it. In every single instance. And so the way I feel about that now is because I feel like throughout this book, and actually he does this a lot in his previous book, Beginnings too, what he'll do is, in my opinion, like in the way that I read it, he'll set up a binary and he'll be like, is it this or this? And it's like a really fundamental binary. And then he'll be like, wait, but the border is what's fucked up. Right? And so, I don't know, I see him setting up a binary now, and I feel like he's going to show us that this shit is actually fundamentally the same. But on one hand, he's talking about like the sort of like, so the way I read this, I can read this in two ways. I feel like I can read this as like the sort of overtly racist material, as opposed to like the sort of more subtly racist material. Or I could read this in a sort of way, it's sort of referential to like the distinction between like political society and civil society that he's talking about with Gramsci earlier, in the sense of like material that's like directly coercive, to use the term, and this is what I'm referencing earlier. He says, Gramsci has made the useful analytic distinction between civil and political society, in which the former is made up of voluntary affiliations like schools, families, and unions, the latter of state institutions, whose role in the polity is direct domination. So it kind of reminds me of that in a sense. I'm not saying it's the same thing, but it reminds me of that in a sense also. As opposed to like overtly and subtly racist, it could also be like doctrines. Like he's been using this word a few times, like doctrine in list form. Doctrines, like so things that like are directly coercive, versus like individual. When I think of individual instances of authors dealing with the Orient, I think of like Flaubert in his earlier example, or the lustful Turk here. Or like, at the beginning of the book, Chateaubriand and Nerval, right? Like these authors who are actually they're creating stories, they're creating fictions. They're not like dictating how the world as it is should be. They're creating new worlds. So that's kind of actually probably, now that I'm thinking about it out loud, a better way that I would read this. And let's keep reading. In a sense, the two alternatives, general and particular, are really two perspectives on the same material. Okay, so there you go. Right? Okay, so the way that I was kind of approaching it, I think, is kind of, yeah, okay. In both instances, one would have to deal with pioneers in the field, like William Jones, with great artists like Nerval or Flaubert. Wow! Okay. And why would it not be possible to employ both perspectives together, or one after the other? Isn't there an obvious danger of distortion of precisely the kind that academic Orientalism has always been prone to? If either too general or too specific a level of description is maintained systematically? So, I'm thinking about this for a second. So when I think of like when he asks, why would it not be possible to employ both perspectives together? What I hear him asking is like, why is it so unbelievable that these concepts left and right need each other? Why is it so unbelievable that these concepts good and bad need each other? Why is it so unbelievable that they are actually together in a more fundamental way than they are separate? Unless you've already assumed the universality of their scope. And what I mean by that is like how far they reach. Unless you've already assumed that there's nothing else outside of it. Unless you've already assumed that that division is just the truth. That's how I kind of read that. And so then when he says, isn't there an obvious danger of distortion of precisely the kind that academic Orientalism has always been prone to? If either too general or too specific a level of description is maintained systematically? So the way that I understand this sentence I'm trying to think of maintained systematically in relation to this of precisely the kind that So how has academic Orientalism always been prone to systematically maintaining things? That's the first thing I ask when I'm thinking about what this means. And then I think of how he's talked about the academic sort of tendency of Orientalism. First, he talked about it in his first definition, as we remember, right? The first definition, the most readily accepted designation is an academic one. Anyone who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient. But in a later place, he talks about like, I forget where it is. Honestly, I totally forget where it is. Like I usually have a good sense of where something is around, but I totally forget where this is, so I'm just not going to even try to find it right now. But in another place from what we've kind of already discussed in our streams, he kind of talks about the academic tendency as a tendency towards like solidifying something as knowledge. And so when I think of like how academic Orientalism has been prone to maintaining something systematically, the way that I understand that is like the sort of academic Orientalism is like prone to reinforcing the truthness of a certain system. So maintaining the system. That's what I understand from that. To sort of arguing that that system is all there is. And that's a distortion for him. And it's not to say that he's talking about maintained, so systematically maintained. He's talking about like its process is systematic. I understand that. But the maintenance is also of a sort of system, is what I'm saying. Or a sort of system of beliefs or a certain whatever. So for example, like what I think of when I think about that is like how so much of the work in like the social sciences, for example, wants to maintain the idea that there is something called a society, whether or not it's critiquing it. It also sort of like universalizes that idea so that there can't be anything thought of outside of like the society in the way that like the West has been thinking about it, right? There's always a sort of like a concept that it's working within, and it wants to act like it's not working within a concept. Or that concept is just the truth. So like in the humanities, which like is the kind of school that I'm in, the concept is generally of the human. All this work, no matter how critical, wants to maintain the idea that there is a universal truth about the human that never changes. All the way from like canonical Western humanism, which is like exalting the human, to like Orlando Patterson, who is a more recent philosopher, who in his book Slavery and Social Death says in the introduction, I am trying to advance a universal theory of the human, as the human always needs a figure of the slave. And so this is like obviously like a very, very like critical approach to the concept of the human, but he's still participating in the project in that he is advancing that there is a universal truth about the human. So that the human is a concept that never changes, that is completely universally applicable. And so like even at those are like the two poles that I can think of like a sort of humanism, right? But any like work, so that's what I think of when I think of this, like maintaining like the work of an academic Orientalism to maintain a sort of, to systematically maintain a sort of idea of truth, right? Okay. And so I want to just read this paragraph back and then go on. If we can point to great Orientalist works of genuine scholarship, we need to also note that Renan. We can point to great Orientalist works of genuine scholarship. We need to also note that Renan and Gobineau's racial ideas came out of the same impulse as did a great many Victorian pornographic novels. And yet, one must repeatedly ask oneself whether what matters in Orientalism is the general group of ideas overriding the mass of material, about which who could deny they were shot through with doctrines of European superiority, various kinds of racism, imperialism, and the like, dogmatic views of the Oriental as a kind of ideal and unchanging abstraction, or the much more varied work produced by almost uncountable individual writers whom one would take up as individual instances of authors dealing with the Orient. In a sense, the two alternatives, general and particular, are really two perspectives on the same material. In both instances, one would have to deal with pioneers in the field like William Jones, with great artists like Nerval or Flaubert. And why would it not be possible to employ both perspectives together, or one after the other? Isn't there an obvious danger of distortion, of precisely the kind that academic Orientalism has always been prone to, if either too general or too specific a level of description is maintained systematically? And when I read this one more time, I kind of see, I'm kind of reflecting on certain aspects of it that I think I missed before. And so, but I'm now understanding them as a whole paragraph. And so like, I think we can just see the word unchanging here is really a corroboration of this sort of inertness and the ideas of movement versus inertness that we've kind of been talking about throughout. So that if something is seen as having less value, it necessarily is sort of less able to move. And in order to kind of reinforce its valuelessness, you have to reinforce its unmovability. And then you could really see what I was calling in my last stream the carcerality of this sort of way of being, which is the way of being that wants to cage in the thing that it is subordinate to it, by way of description in one sense, or representation in one sense, and in another real sense, by way of literal prisons. But it's the sort of way of being that lends itself to the sort of carcerality at every single level. Like one of my best friends, I was hanging out with her on Friday, and she was just like teaching me that like when settlers first came to the like North America, they like the first two things that she was reading about, like a settler colony, and the first two things that they built were a prison and a cemetery. And so you can really see in this opportunity where they have a like what they think is a blank slate to create a new world. The fundamental point with which they create that new world is a prison. And so you could really see the way in which their way of being is already constituting this sort of stuff. So that's one thing that I think of with unchanging. And then when I think of an unchanging abstraction, particularly, it reminds me of like the beginning of this book with this example where he's observing these people that are actually real, but he literally can only think about them in the abstract. Like what they mean for him, right? And this thing about abstraction sort of being violence is always so interesting to me, because what we're doing when we're thinking about things like this is we're really thinking in abstraction, right? But yet it's not so simple. Like something that always strikes me is there's a book by a writer named Christina Sharp called In the Wake. And in the introduction to the book, she's talking about at one point the reason that she's writing the book. And she quotes this other thinker named Saidiya Hartman, and she says, let me actually pull it up. She says here, and I'm going to read this. I include the personal here to connect the social forces on a specific particular family's being in the wake to those of all black people in the wake, to mourn and to illustrate the ways our individual lives are always swept up in the wake, produced and determined, though not absolutely, by the afterlives of slavery. Put another way, I include the personal here in order to position this work and myself in and of the wake. The autobiographical example, says Saidiya Hartman, is not a personal story that folds onto itself. It's not about navel-gazing. It's really about trying to look at historical and social process and one's own formation as a window onto social and historical processes as an example of them. Like Hartman, I include the personal here to tell a story capable of engaging and countering the violence of abstraction. I always think about that so much. I always think about that one passage so much, and I really, really love that part of her work. That whole book, like, that introduction makes me cry every single time I read it. It's really, really beautiful, and really important. It's beautifully written and beautifully argued. But that paragraph particularly always stands out to me, because in a sense what we're doing here is abstraction. And so then you think, like, we're doing abstraction, but in order to counter the violence of abstraction. So how does that make sense? What does that mean? And for me, the way I come to terms with that, and you see it again with Saïd here, he's talking about the Oriental is viewed as an abstraction, right? And he's saying this as the mode of describing a violence, is that you have to be, I don't know, and it might be simplistic, but you have to be able to be with someone at all of levels at the same time. That's just like, I'm not going to go into it that much, but even if you can like come to terms with with somebody's being, an abstraction, whatever that abstraction means, right? So like, even like the example that I was giving yesterday of a friend who told me that in order to be able to be with his loved one who is dead, he had to remember that their relationship is always changing. It's an actual relationship, right? It's not just one with a sort of fixed entity that's now dead, right? His relationship with his loved one who's dead is always changing. And so for me, it's like, that's an example of like what happened. Like, that's like a direct example from what I've talked about the violence of abstraction. Like when someone kind of gets caught in, when you kind of can only see someone through the concept that represents them. And so that's what I kind of take from this word. And those are the kind of some reflections that I have on this paragraph after reading it. And I'm going to kind of move on now to the last paragraph. Isn't there an obvious danger of distortion of precisely the kind that academic Orientalism has always been prone to, if either too general or too specific a level of description is maintained systematically? My two fears are distortion and inaccuracy, or rather the kind of inaccuracy produced by too dogmatic a generality and too positivistic a localized focus. In trying to deal with these problems, I have tried to deal with three main aspects of my own contemporary reality that seem to me to point the way out of the methodological or perspectival difficulties I have been discussing, difficulties that might force one, in the first instance, into writing a coarse polemic on so unacceptably general a level of description as to not be worth the effort, or in the second instance, into writing so detailed and atomistic a series of analyses as to lose all track of the general lines of force informing the field, giving its special cogency. How then to recognize individuality and to reconcile it with its intelligent and by no means passive or merely dictatorial general and hegemonic context? I'm gonna be honest, I didn't even understand one sentence in this paragraph. That's just honest. I didn't even understand one sentence in this paragraph. So, but it is the concluding paragraph of this section, right? And I want to just keep in mind, like, in the last section, we had this sort of thing where he kind of concluded this last section in the paragraph prior to the last one, and then the last paragraph was him connecting it to the next section. I have depended instead upon a different methodological alternative whose backbone in a sense is the set of historical generalizations I have so far been making in this introduction, and it is these that I want to now to discuss in more analytical detail. Okay. So what we can kind of see is in the first section, and another way of saying that is he's outlining his intention with the work. In the second section, he's outlining his method. And let's see how he's connecting this to the third section. And literally, like I said, I don't know what the fuck he's saying here, so I'm doing my best. Okay. My two fears are distortion and inaccuracy, or rather the kind of inaccuracy produced by too dogmatic a generality and too positivistic a localized focus. Let me look up what the word positivistic means, just to kind of get a good definition, because I have an idea, but I just want to like figure it out. Okay, I'm just going to read this definition so I don't use mine, okay, on Google. Because if I use mine, it's going to be more enigmatic and more difficult in this sentence that I'm already struggling to understand, okay? Positivism is the term used to describe an approach to the study of society that relies specifically on scientific evidence such as experiments and statistics to reveal a true nature of how society operates. Okay, so that's helpful, right? My two fears are distortion and inaccuracy, or rather the kind of inaccuracy produced by too dogmatic a generality and too positivistic a local focus. So what I understand by this is like too dogmatic a generality is like you have an idea of like a model of how society works, and you keep trying to fit everything into it. And obviously no model is fully accurate, so there will always be sort of things that trouble a model. But if you get too dogmatic about it, you're distorting sort of conditions or your understanding of conditions in order to fit them into that model. On the other hand, if you have too scientific of a localized focus, meaning you look at everything like so literally, so to speak, then what you're going to be doing is you're going to be having an inaccurate reading in that sense, because you're not really able to connect these things in a way that can make them have meaning and abstraction, so to speak. So you have to sort of find a balance between both, right? And so he's reflecting on what he's been trying to do with his method, is what I'm seeing. In trying to deal with these problems, I have tried to deal with three main aspects of my own contemporary reality that seem to me to point the way out of the methodological or perspectival difficulties I have been discussing. Okay. And that seems like what he's going to do in the next section, right? Because he says, I mentioned 3 aspects of my contemporary reality. I must explain and briefly discuss them now. Okay. Difficulties that might force one, in the first instance, into writing a coarse polemic on so unacceptably general a level of description as to not be worth the effort, or in the second instance, into writing so detailed and atomistic a series of analyses as to lose all track of the general lines of force informing the field, giving it special cogency. So for me here, I think that this is sort of he's like specifying what he was saying in this first sentence. That's how I read this. Okay. And he's trying to point the way out of these difficulties. And these difficulties for him is, again, in finding the balance between either believing that the truth is in, there's no truth in like a sort of abstraction, or that the truth is only an abstraction. Or that believing that the model is fully representative, or believing that there's no model that's fully representative. So he's trying to find a balance between those, right? And he says in the first instance, by believing that the model is fully representative, you might write a coarse polemic, meaning like a rough sort of oppositional writing, which is like so general a level that it's not worth anything. Or in the second instance, where you're too positivistic, it's so detailed and atomistic that it loses all track of the general lines of force informing the field. So we should, these ideas of force and field should be like really, really kind of honed in by now, right? With regard to force, he's talked about this before in his second qualification in this sort of, in this section, right? Where a second qualification is that ideas, cultures, and histories cannot seriously be understood or studied without their force, or more precisely, their configuration of power also being studied. And I think what I'm understanding a lot from this sort of section is how the force of it he's talking about is sort of indicative of Orientalism, right? Informing the field, and then we can really see how throughout this he's kind of calling Orientalism a field in itself, right? A field of discourse. I think he says that when he's talking about Foucault in the first section. Or somewhere. He does call it a field multiple times. For example, when he's talking about this Orientalism can accommodate Aeschylus, Say, and Victor Hugo. This is in the first section. Dante and Karl Marx. A little later in this introduction, I shall deal with the methodological problems one encounters in so broadly construed a field such as this. Right? So he refers to it as a field too. So when he's talking about force and field, for me, he's talking about all track of the general way that the field called Orientalism is developing, right? How then to recognize individuality and to reconcile it with its intelligent and by no means passive or merely dictatorial, general and hegemonic context. Okay, and then this last line. I feel really good right now because I feel like I did not understand even one word of this paragraph, and now it's like really obvious to me. Like it's very easy to read actually. It's one of the easiest paragraphs in the whole book so far, and it was like I didn't even understand a word of it. So I'm feeling really good about it. How then to recognize individuality and to reconcile it with its intelligent and by no means passive or merely dictatorial, general and hegemonic context. When he says recognize individuality, I think he means like the specificity of certain things. That's how I read that. But you know, Saïd actually has this essay that in his book before this, Beginnings, he cites as the precursor to that book, Beginnings, and it's called On Individuality. And so I haven't read it, but that's what that makes me think of. And I wish that I could have read it so I could have been talking about it here. And I do definitely need to read it. But how then to recognize individuality and to reconcile it with its intelligent and no means passive or merely dictatorial, general and hegemonic context? So when he says intelligent and by no means passive and merely dictatorial, the thing that I get from that is like what he was saying earlier about like it would be stupid to think that Orientalism is just a series of lies. Like it's a created body of theory and practice which there's a considerable material investment in, right? But yet what he's kind of saying even before that, right, in this first qualification in this section, is that we shouldn't remember that it's all encompassing. We should remember that it's not all encompassing. Like there's something outside of it, right? So that's what I get when he means, he's like reflecting on what he said, right? But he's saying it in a different way. How then to recognize individuality and to reconcile it with its intelligent and by no means passive or merely dictatorial? So when he says merely dictatorial, I think of like what he's saying about like its absolute power, right? General and hegemonic context. And he's talked about hegemony here a lot. What's up, Shush? Welcome to the chat. I'm about to get off though. So yeah, so it's very interesting because what you sort of see, I think, and I'm looking back at this sort of, in a retrospect in these two sections, and what I'm going to do at the beginning of my next stream tomorrow is I'm going to like go back and I'm going to reflect today and I'm not going to like even consciously do it. I'm just going to let it happen. And then at the beginning of the next stream, I'm going to reflect on how I think I'm seeing the second section as a whole in relation to the first section as a whole. But it seems to me that the first section as a whole really lays out his intention with the work, right? And his second section as a whole really sort of starts to reflect on his own method with the work, so to speak. And I'm using method in a very specific way, in the way that he's kind of using it. He's been using it throughout. And then we can kind of see that it's interesting because then he says, in trying to deal with these problems, I have to try to deal with the three main aspects of my own contemporary reality that seem to me to point the way out of the methodological or perspectival difficulties I have been discussing. Difficulties that might force one, okay. So maybe, I have two ways that I'm wondering how this is going to go. It's either he's been trying to hold on, let me think about this for a sec. Yeah, so I think that in the first section, he's really talking about his intention with the work, which is to basically study this period in which there's a British and French approach to the Orient in order to understand what's happening in whatever's to come with the American approach to the Orient, right? In the second section, he's really laying out his method, right? Which is this sort of, how could I say? I want to use his own words, that's why. I want to say like meta critique, that's why, but I don't want to but you can see it happening throughout the section, right? Where he's constantly going back and stepping outside of the thing that he stepped outside of. And he's doing it with Gramsci too, right? Where he, every time, like even when he cites Gramsci in this section that we've discussed, every time he kind of, even when he talks about Gramsci, he kind of steps outside of Gramsci to say like, he's constantly kind of re-implicating everything he can in it. But I'll have to think about that more, honestly. Because I'm not so sure if he's like squaring his own method or not in this section. Or if he's talking about like the various methods by which you can get caught up in it. But it does seem to me to be clear that what he's going to try to be doing in the next section, and I don't know what this means yet, but I guess we'll see. It's kind of like a cliffhanger, right? what it means when he says, I have tried to deal with three main aspects of my own contemporary reality that seem to me to point the way out of the methodological or perspectival difficulties I have been discussing. So what does it mean to point the way out of these methodological and perspectival difficulties? We'll find out, I guess. And so I think that I'm going to stop there for today because it's a good place to stop because we just finished this section. This next section, it should be known. So we've read about 9 pages so far, which is the first 2 sections. The next section is 20. So it's much, much, much more massive than the previous sections. And so it'll be, I think, a really unique task to be able to kind of discuss it in relation to the first 2 because of its scale. But I wanted to do, and so I guess we'll do that tomorrow. Okay, bye stream. It was fun.